In the hushed cradle of the Tigris, where the winds once whispered through the towers of forgotten kings, the Assyrian Empire was born, an echo carved in stone and blood. Cities gleamed beneath the sun like the eyes of lions, their ziggurats stretching toward the heavens. From dust they rose, from silence they ruled. And though their voices have long faded into the sands, their shadows linger across time, monuments of ambition, faith, and ruin. Tonight we drift through their story, through temples and battlefields, through pride and sorrow, through the twilight of an empire that once thought itself eternal. In the beginning there was only the land between rivers, a breath of earth suspended between two wandering veins of life, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Their waters moved like time itself, slow and unending, whispering to the reeds that bent upon their banks. It was here, in the soft cradle of silt and sky, that humanity first began to dream in the language of permanence. The land was gentle but vast, its horizon stretching into mirage and wind, and beneath that boundless blue, a quiet people began to shape the bones of the world. They were the first settlers of a memory older than kingdoms, gathering reeds for shelter, shaping clay into vessels, learning the patience of rivers. The air carried the scent of wet earth and smoke, the hum of insects and prayer. At dusk the women sang as they kneaded grain into bread. At dawn the men followed the herds and the floods, reading the moods of water and wind. Their days were not yet marked by kings, nor by conquest, but by rhythm, the pulse of nature, and the murmur of divine silence. In time, those who dwelled along the northern bend began to call upon unseen powers. They pressed their palms into clay, carving signs that sought to capture what their hearts could not name, the breath of the gods, the weight of the seasons, the dream of belonging. The gods were many, and their faces were the faces of storms and fire, of mountain lions and the burning sun. Among them, one name rose like a whisper through the reeds, Ashur. It was not yet the name of a city, nor of an empire, but a spirit, a promise wrapped in the breath of dawn. The rivers flooded, receded, and returned again, leaving behind soil dark as memory. From that soil grew barley and faith, both fragile and enduring. The people began to gather near a bend in the Tigris where the waters shimmered like molten bronze at sunset. There they raised small shrines of mud and stone, their walls low but sacred. Smoke curled into the heavens, carrying the scent of burnt offerings and the hopes of the nameless. Each year their settlements grew, and their prayers deepened, like roots reaching for unseen depths. And so, in that tender silence before history learned to speak, Assyria began to breathe. It was not yet a kingdom, not yet a power that would shake the earth. It was only a pulse beneath the soil, a promise forming beneath the gentle weight of centuries. As the stars watched from their patient thrones, the rivers murmured to one another of the dawns yet to come, and of the kings yet unborn. The seasons passed like sighs across the plains. With each flood the land renewed itself, and the people learned to harness the strength of the water. They carved channels into the earth, guiding the river's generosity into fields of barley and flax. From this communion of labor and nature, prosperity began to unfold, slowly, almost reverently, as if the earth itself consented to the birth of civilization. Huts of woven reeds gave way to houses of clay brick, hardened by fire and sunlight. Smoke rose in slender columns, curling into the tranquil air as though the sky itself was learning to listen. Beneath the first dawns of recorded time, humanity stood at the edge of transformation, unknowing yet guided by a quiet rhythm older than speech. The northern wind brought stories from distant valleys, tales of wandering herders, of traders who followed the scent of cedar and copper, of hunters who carried obsidian from the mountains. These voices met at the confluence of rivers and stayed. The settlements grew, clustered like constellations around the waters that gave them life. Children played among the reeds, elders marked the cycles of the moon. And all the while, the god Ashur began to take shape, not merely as a name, but as a center of being. Around his shrine, the people built their first temples, low, stepped structures of mud brick, crowned with clay cones painted in red and black. Here they brought their offerings, grain, oil, lambs, and the air trembled with the scent of smoke and devotion. The priests, guardians of the sacred flame, whispered invocations into the stillness, their voices rising with the hum of insects and the crackle of burning cedar. It was said that the flame never slept, that it mirrored the light of the heavens themselves. In this growing settlement, Ashur, the bond between earth and divinity, was forged. It was not conquest that defined them yet, but reverence. The world felt immense and intimate at once, its mysteries both near and unreachable. The people of the northern Tigris did not yet know of empires, but already they carried within them the seed of endurance, the need to order chaos, to name the nameless, to carve their existence into stone so that even silence might remember them. Each dusk fell softly upon the river's edge, gilding the waters in copper light. The air was thick with song and the rhythm of tools against earth. The first walls rose not for war, but for belonging. Within their embrace, the sound of human striving began to echo, faint but eternal. And when the night descended upon their clay and smoke, the stars leaned closer, as though curious to see what shape these dreamers of dust would take. Time moved like a silent current, carrying the first Assyrians toward the age of cities. The rhythm of daily life deepened, measured now not only by the floods and harvests, but by the steady sound of chisels upon clay. What had once been a settlement of huts began to shimmer with the faint outline of permanence. Streets took form where footsteps had once wandered freely, and the scent of wet brick mingled with the aroma of baking grain. Artisans appeared, their hands calloused and reverent. They shaped figurines from clay, tiny echoes of gods and spirits, their eyes wide with mystery. Others carved tools of bronze, hammered into shape by the will of fire. Traders followed the river's course, bringing lapis from the east and silver from the distant highlands. Each exchange left behind not only goods but whispers, stories of lands beyond the horizon, of kings who ruled by the favor of the heaven. Among the elders, these tales found eager listeners. Beneath the flickering firelight, they pondered the meaning of power, of destiny. The priests spoke of balance, the need to please the gods lest the rivers withdraw their mercy. The people, still bound to the soil, began to imagine something greater, a bond not only between man and God, but between man and the vast, unseen design of time itself. The settlement of Ashur became a living prayer, its houses aligned with the course of the stars, its rituals timed to the dance of the moon. Each season brought new ceremonies, processions where the people carried offerings through streets strewn with petals and ash. Drums echoed across the plain, low and mournful, as though the earth itself joined in their devotion. The high priests recorded these moments upon clay tablets, marking the births, the floods, the celestial omens. Their script, angular, precise, was a language of permanence, a bridge between mortal breath and eternal memory. The first tablets spoke of blessings and harvests, but soon they began to speak of lineage, of families that claimed descent from the first settlers, from those who had stood beside the river when the world was still young. In this way, identity took root. Ashur was no longer a place alone, it was a name that lived within its people. They began to see themselves not as scattered dwellers of the plain, but as chosen, bound by the spirit of their God and the soil beneath their feet. From the humblest brickmaker to the priest in his temple robes, all shared the quiet certainty that their city was more than clay and water, it was the axis of the divine. And so, as the stars circled above and the fires flickered below, the city's breath deepened. The first embers of destiny began to glow, faint but steady. As dawn broke upon the Tigris once more, its golden light revealed walls that had not been there before. Signs that the dream of Ashur was beginning to rise from the realm of faith into the realm of stone. As the years gathered like grains of sand upon the shore, the settlement of Ashur began to speak in the voice of a city. Walls rose higher, not merely as shelter, but as symbols of endurance. The people carved their stories into foundation stones, believing that what was written in earth might be read by the gods. Columns and altars took shape, adorned with reliefs of eagles and lions, creatures that watched from the thresholds as guardians of both heaven and home. The river's breath, once wild and untamed, was now harnessed by canals and dikes that shimmered beneath the sun. The mastery of water became the mastery of life itself. In the rhythm of irrigation and the hum of labor, the Assyrian heart learned patience. From sunrise to dusk, the fields glowed with green, and the people sang to the turning of the seasons. The wind carried their voices far beyond the walls, across the plains and into the mountains, as though the earth itself joined their song. Within the temple precinct, the priests began to record more than ritual. They noted trade, weather, the gifts of foreign lands, cedar from the west, tin from the east, lapis from the mountains, all flowed into Ashur's hands. Each new treasure was laid before the altar as a sign that the god favored them, that prosperity was a covenant written in the very soil. Yet with abundance came longing. The elders looked upon the fields and saw that they stretched farther than one man could rule, farther than one family could tend. Questions stirred like wind through the reeds. Who would guide this growing city? Who would speak for Ashur himself? In time, from among the noble families, one was chosen not by conquest, but by reverence. He was called Ensi, the steward of Ashur, guardian of its flame. His duty was to keep the city in harmony with heaven, to ensure that every harvest, every building, every prayer remained aligned with divine order. Beneath his rule, law began to take shape, drawn not from ambition but from devotion. Thus, in quiet ceremony, the first Assyrian ruler took his seat, not upon a throne of gold, but upon a carved stone altar. His hands rested upon clay tablets, his gaze lifted to the smoke that rose toward the gods. In his presence, the people bowed not to a man, but to the reflection of their faith made flesh. The temple bells rang softly that evening, their sound drifting over the river and through the distant fields. The sun sank into the horizon, turning the waters to bronze. A hush fell across the city, deep and holy, as if the entire land exhaled in unison. And in that silence, something ancient awoke, the faint stirring of destiny that would one day move mountains and topple kings. The new steward of Ashur ruled not with the hand of conquest, but with the patience of a shepherd. His reign was marked by balance between the flood and the drought, between labor and rest, between reverence and ambition. Under his watch, the temple's flame burned without interruption, its smoke rising each morning to mingle with the dawn. The city thrived in its rhythm, guided by the calm certainty that heaven and earth were still in harmony. Generations passed in quiet succession. Children grew to elders, elders to memory, and yet the city endured, its clay foundations sinking deeper into the soft heart of Mesopotamia. Around its walls, new hamlets appeared, offering grain and livestock in exchange for protection, until Ashur became the silent center of a widening circle of life. The land began to speak of it with reverence, as though the city itself were alive, breathing with the steady pulse of its people. Within the temples, however, the scribes began to notice the slow movement of time. They saw that other cities, Eshnunna, Mari, Babylon, were rising in strength. Their kings built palaces that glittered in the sun. Their armies marched across plains in the name of gods just as old. The priests of Ashur spoke softly of this, wondering whether the river that had once given birth to peace might also carry the whispers of ambition. The young men of the city trained not only in prayer but in arms. Spears were fashioned from bronze, shields hammered into curves that caught the light like molten mirrors. Yet there was no war, only the preparation for one, a readiness woven into the city's breath. The Ensi watched these changes with solemn eyes. He knew that devotion alone could no longer guard what had been built from dust. On the high terraces, he walked among the olive trees and looked upon the river at dusk. The Tigris gleamed like a serpent of light, winding through the plains toward distant lands. In that endless flow he saw both beauty and forewarning, the reminder that power, like water, never stays still. It moves, it hungers, it reshapes. And so he began to dream of fortifications stronger than prayer, of boundaries drawn not by faith but by the sword. That night the stars hung heavy over the city, their glow reflected in the river's slow current. The priests tended to the sacred flame, the farmers sang their harvest songs, and the young men trained in silence. Each soul played its part in the quiet preparation for what none could yet name, the beginning of empire. And as dawn returned, painting the plains in pale gold, Ashur stood upon the threshold of change. its destiny stirring like the first tremor beneath the soil of time. The dawn came softly to Ashur, spilling over the river like molten amber. The city that once prayed in whispers now stood with a steadier breath, its walls stronger, its heart louder. From the terraces and shrines rose a new kind of silence, the silence of preparation, of a people aware that the horizon had begun to move toward them. The age of peace was fading like mist, and in its place the pulse of kingship began to stir. The priests still tended to the sacred flame, but now their prayers were echoed by the clang of bronze, by the rhythmic sound of hammers shaping destiny into form. Within the temple precinct, artisans carved the likeness of gods, broad-winged beings with eyes that saw both earth and heaven. The god Ashur, once a breath upon the wind, now gazed down from reliefs of stone and clay. His image no longer hovered above the fields, it ruled them. It was said that the first king rose not by the sword, but by the will of heaven. His name would pass like incense through the centuries, Shamshi-Adad, the Lion of the North. Under his reign, the scattered villages of the Tigris bent toward unity. The lands between the rivers began to speak one language of obedience, of labor, of divine order. His palaces shimmered in the morning light, carved with the stories of creation, of gods walking among men. The people bowed before him not as a conqueror, but as a chosen instrument of the divine. Yet beneath this divine order, something restless stirred. The scribes who etched the king's triumphs upon clay began to record more than prayer, they chronicled ambition. Tablets spoke of new cities built, of fortresses raised, of rivers harnessed to feed fields beyond sight. In these lines of wet clay, power took its first written form. The city of Ashur, once the child of the river, became its master. Caravans wound through its gates, laden with copper, timber, and spices. The sound of trade mingled with the music of ritual, wealth and faith intertwined like vines upon the same wall. And through it all, the king's seal, the lion pressing upon the clay, marked every decree, every promise. But even as prosperity swelled, the air trembled with a quiet foreboding. The priests dreamt of omens, rivers running red, eclipses devouring the sun. The old harmony between gods and men began to shift. The people who once built in worship now built in glory. And so, upon the banks of the eternal river, the story of Assyria's kings began, not as a hymn, but as a heartbeat. As the sun faded beyond the hills, the clay tablets cooled in their kilns, each one carrying a fragment of destiny, soft, wet, and waiting to harden into eternity. As the years gathered like dust upon stone, the city of Ashur swelled with a new kind of purpose. The god who once watched from the temple's inner sanctum now seemed to dwell within the very stones of the city, within every law, every tablet, every heart that beat in its shadow. The Assyrians had learned not only to build, but to command. Beneath the reign of Shamshi-Adad, the craftsmen and scribes became the architects of order. In the glow of oil lamps, they pressed reeds into soft clay, their fingers steady as they wrote the will of the king. These tablets were no longer prayers but proclamations, decrees that stretched beyond the temple walls to shape the fates of distant lands. Grain and tribute, soldiers and slaves, the measured breath of an empire still in infancy, all recorded in the language of eternity. The king's palace rose upon terraces of stone and clay, its gates adorned with carved lions whose eyes glimmered with the light of dawn. They were symbols of dominion, of courage sanctified by faith. Each wall was painted with scenes of myth, the god Ashur soaring above rivers, his chariot pulled by winged bulls, the king standing beneath him, the chosen hand of divine purpose. Beneath this imagery, the rhythm of life moved like a great procession. The markets teemed with traders from the mountains and plains, their dialects blending into a single tongue of commerce and allegiance. Bronze glimmered on the arms of the soldiers who guarded the gates, and the scent of cedar drifted from the carpenters' workshops. The city was alive, its pulse measured not by seasons, but by ambition. And yet, amid the splendor, the priests grew uneasy. They saw that the king's power, though blessed in ritual, had begun to eclipse the sanctity of the temple. The smoke of sacrifice rose not only to the gods, but to the name of the ruler himself. Songs once dedicated to Ashur now wove the king's name into their verses, praising his hand as the bringer of rain, his gaze as the keeper of light. Still the people rejoiced, for to them the king was the bridge between heaven and earth, the lion who roared on their behalf, the guardian of their fields and their faith. The clay tablets that bore his laws also carried the weight of belief, pressed into permanence by hands that knew they were shaping something greater than themselves. Beyond the city's edge, the plains shimmered in the sun. New settlements rose beneath the banner of Ashur, their walls mirroring the great city's strength. The river flowed through them all, silent and knowing, as if it had seen such greatness before, and knew, too, how swiftly it could fade. And as twilight gathered across the northern hills, the flame of empire burned quietly on the horizon, small yet steady, waiting for the wind that would make it blaze. In the cool silence of dawn, Shamshi-Adad would stand upon the palace terrace and look eastward, where the sky blushed with the color of baked clay. He saw in that horizon the promise of eternity, a kingdom unending, written upon the tablets of heaven. Around him, the early empire stirred like a great lion stretching before the hunt. Messengers rode out from the city gates, their horses' hooves beating against the plains like drums of prophecy. They carried words sealed in clay, edicts, alliances, warnings. For the Assyrians had learned that conquest began not with sword or spear, but with the whisper of command. To rule was to be remembered, and the memory of kings was carved not in flesh but in stone. In the heart of Ashur, beneath vaulted ceilings painted in stars, the priests of the temple performed their daily rites. They lifted their voices to the god whose name crowned their city. Ashur, they sang, had chosen this place as the navel of the world, the place where divine breath mingled with mortal ambition. Yet as the offerings burned and the incense rose, a quiet truth lingered in the smoke. The god had grown distant. His silence was vast, his will interpreted through the hand of kings. It was in these years that the Assyrian heart hardened. To survive among the shifting alliances of neighboring lands, they learned the language of strength. Each campaign became a ritual, each victory an offering to the throne. The first walls of empire rose not from faith alone, but from necessity, defenses carved from fear and desire alike. Clay tablets record the names of conquered towns, their tribute counted like grains of sand. They tell of prisoners marched beneath the sun, of kings kneeling before the lion of Ashur, their crowns placed at his feet. But between those lines of conquest, another story hums, one of restless creation. For even as they conquered, the Assyrians built canals to tame the rivers, fortresses to guard the passes, temples to mirror the sky. Each brick was an act of devotion, each inscription a testament to the yearning that defined their age, the yearning to touch eternity. The craftsmen who shaped these stones did not think themselves makers of empire. They were servants of order, preserving the fragile harmony between heaven and earth. But the clay remembered everything. It remembered the first laws, written in reverence. It remembered the shift from faith to fear, from prayer to decree. And though the clay could not speak, the silence between its etched lines began to echo with warning. As the sun sank behind the hills, the city glowed in the amber light of evening. The people of Ashur knelt before their idols, unaware that the foundation of empire is never still, that beneath its weight the earth always murmurs of change. And far beyond the walls, in the distant valleys where shadow met flame, new powers stirred. Tribes and cities watching the rise of the lion, waiting for their turn beneath its gaze. Time moved like a quiet river through the plains, carrying both faith and conquest toward an unseen sea. As seasons turned and the rivers rose again, the sons of Shamshi-Adad took their father's seat beneath the banners of the lion. The palace that once echoed with the measured footfalls of a single ruler now pulsed with competing hearts, each one beating to the rhythm of ambition. Yet the city endured. Its walls, kissed by the sun and wind, seemed to breathe with a life of their own. From the terraces, one could see the curve of the Tigris glimmering in the distance, a silver serpent threading through fields of barley and stone. Beneath that tranquil surface, the story of Assyria deepened, its roots tightening, its reach expanding. The scribes, ever watchful, filled their tablets with the pulse of empire. They wrote of markets alive with color and scent, of caravans winding in from Elam and Mari, of traders carrying tin and lapis, wine and wool. In the heart of Ashur, the temple doors never closed. Priests moved through corridors of shadow and flame, whispering invocations to gods whose patience was as deep as time. But the spirit of the people had changed. Where once the hands that molded clay had trembled in awe, they now moved with confidence, even defiance. The artisans carved lions with open jaws, their eyes wide with fury. On the walls of the temple, kings were no longer depicted as servants of the gods, but as their equals, men who ruled by divine right, their will indistinguishable from heaven's decree. And in this transformation lay both beauty and peril. For though the Assyrian kings claimed the favor of Ashur, they began to build thrones higher than the altars, palaces grander than the temples. The divine and the mortal blurred into a single vision of glory, and in that vision, humility began to fade. Still, the empire thrived. Armies marched through the lowlands, their banners fluttering like tongues of flame. Captured cities were rebuilt in Assyria's image, each wall a mirror, each gate an echo. From these conquests, tribute flowed back to Ashur, gold, cedar, lapis, and the labor of foreign hands. The city glittered in wealth, and the riverbanks hummed with song. Yet in the quiet hours before dawn, the wind that swept through the streets carried another kind of sound, a whisper of restlessness, as if the clay itself dreamed of freedom from the weight it bore. The priests spoke of omens. The stars no longer followed their expected courses. Storms came without season, the rivers flooded as if stirred by unseen wrath. Some said Ashur had turned his gaze away, displeased by the pride of his chosen sons. Others whispered that the god remained silent not out of anger, but out of sorrow, that the balance between faith and power had begun to crumble. Still, the kings did not listen. They sent more armies into the hills and valleys, seeking to silence the murmur of rebellion. They built towers to scrape the heavens, declaring that even the gods must behold their might. But even as stone rose upon stone, the foundation trembled. For the lion that ruled the plains had begun to hunger for more than the earth could give. And in the gathering twilight, a shadow lengthened across the land. A shadow cast not by the sun, but by the hearts of men. As the night deepened over Ashur's walls, a quiet unease settled upon the kingdom, soft as dust yet heavy as prophecy. With each passing year, the reign of the early kings shaped the city into a living reflection of ambition. The palace terraces rose higher, their carved lions and winged guardians staring down upon the streets below, watching both citizen and soldier as they moved like threads in a grand design. The temple bells rang each morning and evening, a gentle rhythm that guided both faith and fear, binding the people to their god and to their king in equal measure. The scribes labored tirelessly, their reeds pressed into clay with deliberate precision, recording harvests, alliances, and campaigns. Each tablet carried not just the weight of ink and clay, but the weight of permanence, the memory of a people who sought to carve themselves into eternity. They wrote of victories and tributes, of kings walking beneath the gaze of Ashur, whose wings stretched across the heavens. The very act of writing became sacred, as though the tablets themselves breathed in the presence of the divine. Beyond the palace, the city expanded like the roots of a great tree. Streets wound between clay houses, markets thrummed with traders, calls and workshops rang with the soft music of artisans shaping bronze and wood. Soldiers trained along the riverbanks, their shields and spears glinting in the morning light, a silent promise of both protection and dominance. The city was alive in its every breath, its pulse echoing in stone, river, and song. Yet, for all its splendor, there was an undercurrent of unease. The priests whispered of omens, eclipses, unseasonal storms, and strange movements in the river. Some feared that the king's glory had grown too vast, that the balance between mortal and divine had shifted. And though these murmurs passed through the city like wind through reeds, they were never loud enough to reach the ear of the king. His eyes were fixed upon expansion, upon legacy, upon the shape of a kingdom that would outlast the century. In these years, Ashur became both cradle and forge of empire. Children born into the city grew familiar with its rhythm, learning to carry offerings to the temple, to follow the call of the markets, to honor the king's decree. They absorbed, without question, the presence of power in every stone, every river bend, every carved lion. The cycle of life intertwined with the cycle of rule, each feeding the other in quiet symphony. As twilight fell upon the northern plains, the city's lamps glimmered like stars mirrored upon the Tigris. Smoke from hearths and altars drifted upward, mingling with the cool evening air. Somewhere beyond the walls, distant settlements stirred, watching the rise of Ashur with both awe and apprehension. The empire, though still young, had begun to cast a shadow far beyond its own borders, a shadow that would stretch long and deep, shaping the course of all who dwelled near the rivers. And as the moon rose, pale and steady, over the city of Ashur, the clay tablets rested in silence, holding within them the murmurs of ambition and the heartbeat of an empire yet in its infancy. The pulse of Ashur had changed. Where once the city breathed to the rhythm of prayer and harvest, it now moved to the beat of iron-shod feet and the measured clang of bronze. War, quiet at first, became the lifeblood of the empire, a force that shaped both landscape and heart. The river that had once nourished fields now mirrored the glint of spearheads and shield rims, catching the light like scattered stars upon a restless sea. Under Tukulti-Ninurta, the northern plains trembled with the march of soldiers, their ranks disciplined to a rhythm older than memory. They moved like a single creature, a serpent of bronze and leather, carrying the will of the king across fields that stretched beyond sight. From hill to valley, the earth itself seemed to bend beneath their passage. Their triumphs were recorded in clay, each tablet pressed with the seal of victory, yet between the lines of conquest whispered the first shadows of unease. For every city that fell, for every king who bowed, a murmur of cost threaded the air. The campaigns were not merely for land, they were the forging of legend. Tiglath-Pileser I led his forces beyond the familiar hills, into lands of strange tongues and unknown gods. The plains burned with fires of submission, yet the imagery of battle was both terrifying and beautiful, horses galloping like rivers of dust, archers bending bows in unison, warriors moving as one under the sun's cruel glare. Even in victory there was a quiet horror. The screams of the fallen, the smoke of homes turned to ash, lingered in the wind long after the armies had passed. Within the city, the king's palaces reflected the duality of Assyria itself, opulent in gold and cedar, yet tempered by discipline and fear. Bronze gates gleamed in the morning light, and lions carved from stone seemed to roar silently at the courtyard's edges. Soldiers trained in drills that mimicked the chaos of war, their movements precise as prayer, each spear a line of devotion to the god Ashur and the crown that bore his blessing. The people who remained within the city walls grew accustomed to this rhythm. The presence of violence was woven into daily life as naturally as the rising sun. Yet even as the empire expanded, a quiet tension threaded the air. The priests observed omens with more care, noting eclipses, unseasonal storms, and unusual migrations of birds. The king's victories, though splendid, were always accompanied by hints of imbalance, a subtle warning that the strength of Ashur came at a cost. In the shadow of conquest, the very clay that recorded triumph seemed to tremble with memory, holding fast to the silent echoes of what had been lost. And so, in the hush of evening, when the soldiers returned to their camps and the fires of the cities burned low, the empire exhaled. The victories, the spoils, the expansion, all carried a weight beyond human measure. Even in moments of apparent peace, the shadow of war stretched across the land like a long, quiet river. As the sun dipped beyond the western hills, Ashur's banners flickered in the wind, and the specter of ambition, sharpened by spears and tempered in shadow, settled upon the plains like a patient predator. The campaigns of Tukulti-Ninurta carved paths across hills and rivers, leaving both awe and ruin in their wake. Each advance of the army was measured, deliberate, a movement that transformed not only the land, but the very rhythm of life within Ashur. The soldiers carried the weight of empire upon their shoulders, their discipline honed in the fires of obedience and the shadow of divine expectation. In the northern marches, the enemy's walls rose like cliffs of defiance, yet they yielded before the methodical precision of Assyria's forces. Archers loosed their arrows in unison, a storm of iron and intent. Cavalry swept across open fields like tides, their hooves striking the soil in a rhythm older than the sun. Cities fell not in haste, but in the quiet inevitability of a machine honed for conquest. And with each victory, the spoils were carried back to Ashur. Grain, gold, timber, and captives, whose silence filled the nights with a tension the priests whispered about but dared not name. Within the city, life continued as though untouched, yet its pulse mirrored that of the army. Markets thrived, yet every transaction bore the imprint of a distant conquest. Artisans molded bronze and carved stone, lions and bulls to guard gates and temples, and yet there was a subtle change in their hands, a steadiness sharpened by necessity, a reverence now mingled with apprehension. The king's presence was both protector and overseer, and even the gods, it seemed, watched quietly from their pedestal. Tiglath-Pileser I continued this legacy, extending Ashur's reach beyond familiar lands. His campaigns were described on tablets with meticulous care, chronicling each siege, each skirmish, each negotiated surrender. In these inscriptions, the acts of war became a ritual. Smoke rising from conquered cities mirrored the incense of the temples. The cries of prisoners echoed the prayers of the faithful. Violence was sacred, a bridge between man and God, and yet the whispers of cost threaded through every line. The soldiers themselves were a study in paradox, at once instruments of destruction and symbols of order. Each spear, each shield, each chariot was pressed into service with the discipline of devotion. When the dust settled, when fires cooled and banners were furled, there remained a quiet unease that no trumpet or hymn could dispel. In the stillness, the empire heard the soft murmur of loss, the shadow of lives claimed in the pursuit of power. And within the palace, the king walked among carved lions and winged guardians, seeing in their stone eyes the reflection of his own ambition. He knew that every victory carried a weight beyond measure, and yet he pressed forward, guided by the certainty that Ashur's destiny was not merely to endure, but to dominate. The city and the army were two halves of a whole, the pulse of war flowing through both, shaping the rhythm of the empire like the current of the river itself. As the dusk deepened, shadows stretched across the plains, wrapping the empire in quiet reflection. The victories were many, but the whisper of cost threaded the air, soft as sand yet unrelenting as time itself. Beyond the city's walls, the campaigns unfolded with a rhythm as inevitable as the river's flow. Tukulti-Ninurta's armies moved through valleys and hills with silent purpose, leaving behind cities transformed into tributaries of Ashur's growing dominion. Yet the stories of conquest were not told only in bronze and clay. They were carried by the wind, whispered among the reeds and across the plains. The scent of smoke and the shimmer of dust marked the memory of victory, and even the distant hills seemed to bow before the steady march of the Assyrian host. In each encounter, the soldiers practiced a discipline that was both terrifying and beautiful. Archers released volleys that fell like rain upon walls, while infantry advanced in tight formation, their shields forming a moving rampart. Cavalry flanked the unprepared, their hooves drumming the pulse of inevitability. And yet, even in these displays of power, there was a quiet grace, a choreography of destruction that seemed almost sacred, a reflection of the god Ashur's measured hand. The spoils of war returned to Ashur, filling its temples and granaries alike. Captured artisans were pressed into service, shaping palaces and temples with skill born of fear and necessity. Traders followed the army's trail, exchanging exotic wares for obedience and tribute. The city grew richer, taller, and more imposing, yet every stone laid, every gate adorned, carried with it the shadow of the lives that had built it unwillingly. Within the palace, Tiglath-Pileser, I studied maps of distant lands, tracing the edges of rivers and mountains, plotting the next advance of his forces. The lion that had guided Ashur's rise now prowled beyond its own borders, seeking horizons that promised both glory and danger. Counselors and scribes recorded each campaign with painstaking care, embedding within clay the memory of conquest, the ritual of domination, and the whisper of sacrifice that accompanied it. And still, beneath this outward order, a tension lingered. The priests observed the stars with renewed vigilance, noting eclipses, unusual alignments, and the migration of birds. The people felt the weight of constant vigilance, a rhythm dictated not by the seasons, but by the march of armies and the shadow of ambition. Even the rivers, so long a source of life, seemed to reflect the unease of the land, their currents carrying whispers of change to distant shores. In the hush of night, the city seemed to breathe with the memory of war. Fires burned low in outlying villages, the quiet murmur of soldiers' voices blending with the soft sigh of the wind through the reeds. The empire, though young, already bore the imprint of discipline and cruelty, of triumph and the unspoken cost that accompanied it. Every victory carried the shadow of the fallen, every conquest left a trace in the clay that remembered all things. As the moon rose above the plains, casting long shadows over Ashur's walls, the pulse of empire settled into the quiet rhythm of the night, a rhythm that would grow ever stronger, yet always whisper of the cost that lay beneath the glory. The campaigns pressed ever onward, carrying the Assyrian armies into lands both familiar and strange. Tukulti-Ninurta's conquests had set the tone, order imposed through steel, glory carved upon walls and clay, and the god Ashur invoked with every arrow loosed, every wall breached. Tiglath-Pileser I extended this design into a pattern of dominance that moved like a shadow across the northern lands, touching cities, rivers, and mountains alike. Yet even as the armies advanced, the shadow of human cost lay heavy upon the land. Villages burned quietly in the distance, their smoke rising in thin spirals that carried the lament of those who had fallen. Families vanished from fields once fertile, replaced by tribute collectors, soldiers, and the silent footfalls of occupation. The priests watched these movements and whispered that the divine favor of Ashur had limits, that even the god of the city could not erase the toll of ambition. Inside Ashur, the palace glimmered in contrast. Walls painted with winged bulls and roaring lions bore witness to victories both celebrated and feared. Courtyards echoed with the disciplined march of soldiers, the clang of bronze against stone, and the distant hum of markets alive with trade. And yet beneath this orchestrated splendor, a quiet unease threaded through every hall and alley. The people of the city sensed that with each conquest, the empire grew larger, but the heart of Ashur grew heavier. The soldiers themselves became both instruments and symbols of this power. Spear in hand, shield raised, they moved like extensions of the city itself, embodying both discipline and terror. Their training was relentless, their obedience absolute. Even the smallest villages near the city walls bore the mark of their presence, adopting the rhythm of readiness that mirrored the pulse of the army. In their march, in the echo of their boots against the earth, the Assyrian state itself was made manifest. A living, breathing force that commanded respect, awe, and fear in equal measure. And yet, in the silence between battles, the empire seemed to pause and consider the cost of its triumphs. The rivers carried the murmur of sorrow, the winds whispered through fields scorched or abandoned, and the clay tablets pressed with victories seemed to tremble with memory. Victory had its glory, but it demanded a price, and the people of Ashur, soldiers and civilians alike, felt the weight of that debt in quiet moments, beneath the glow of firelight and in the hush of early morning prayer. As the stars emerged above the plains, Ashur settled into the night, the fires of victory dimming, the shadow of empire stretching long and silent across the conquered lands, whispering of both power and its inevitable cost. The northern winds carried the scent of iron and dust across the plains, a reminder that the heartbeat of Assyria was now inseparable from the rhythm of war. Tukulti-Ninurta and Tiglath-Pileser I had forged more than armies. They had forged a legacy in which every victory became a thread in the intricate tapestry of empire. The soldiers, moving like shadows upon the land, were both guardians and harbingers, embodiments of a discipline that merged mortal will with divine mandate. In the quiet hours between campaigns, the city itself seemed to reflect the duality of the Assyrian soul. Palaces gleamed with the light of polished bronze, walls adorned with lions and winged bulls whose eyes seemed to hold the memory of every conquest. Temples rose higher than ever before, their steps lined with clay tablets that recorded the names of the vanquished, the tribute collected, and the glory of the king. Yet in the shadow of these monuments, a subtle tremor persisted, an awareness that the cost of greatness was written in silence as much as in stone. The scribes, diligent and reverent, chronicled both triumph and toil. Their reeds pressed into clay, preserving campaigns with meticulous care, but between the lines were the quiet notes of consequence. Cities left in ruin, rivers diverted, and families uprooted. Even as Ashur expanded its dominion, these tablets served as a reminder that the empire's strength was measured not only in gold or territory, but in the endurance of the land and the spirit of its people. The soldiers who returned from distant campaigns carried with them both honor and weariness. Their armor gleamed under the morning sun, their banners rippled like fire across the walls, yet their eyes held the weight of experiences not easily erased. In every village along the river, stories were told, some of triumph, some of sorrow. The city absorbed them all, weaving them into the quiet fabric of empire, where memory and ambition intertwined. Even as new lands bent beneath Ashur's rule, the priests watched the sky with renewed vigilance. The stars, the storms, the migrations of birds, each became a signal, a subtle reminder that the god Ashur's favor was not infinite. And though kings moved with the certainty of destiny, whispers of doubt threaded through the corridors of power. What was built through steel and strategy could also unravel if balance was forgotten, if the shadow of ambition eclipsed the light of devotion. And so, as twilight descended upon the plains, the empire exhaled its long, measured breath. Spears lay sheathed, banners fluttered in the cooling wind, and in the hush between victories, the Assyrian heart felt the quiet weight of its own power, knowing that every shadow cast by triumph would stretch into the generations yet to come. The Tigris shimmered like molten gold in the early light, and upon its northern banks, Nineveh rose slowly from the dust of memory. The city seemed almost to awaken with the sun itself, each stone reflecting its glow, each carved lion and winged guardian poised as if to greet the heavens. It was a city that breathed ambition, yet did so with the poise of a quiet god. The palaces, vast and solemn, glimmered in ochre and gold, their terraces stretching toward the horizon as if to touch the sky. Under Ashurnasirpal the city became more than a place of administration. It was a living testament to power made tangible. Courtyards echoed with the careful footfalls of soldiers and the soft murmur of attendants, while fountains and canals reflected the morning light like liquid fire. Lions, winged bulls, and guardians carved from alabaster and stone gazed forever eastward, eternal sentinels of an empire that was learning to see itself not merely in conquest, but in permanence. The libraries, filled with clay tablets inscribed with stars, prayers, and law, became the quiet heart of Nineveh. Here, scribes bent over their reeds, pressing words into wet clay, recording not only the deeds of kings, but the rhythm of the empire itself. Tales of distant campaigns, of tribute carried across mountains and plains, and of rituals that bound man and god together, all found their place upon these shelves. The air was fragrant with the scent of oil lamps and incense, mingling with the quiet murmur of study. Beyond the walls, the city sprawled into a mosaic of streets, markets, and temples. Traders came from the far reaches of the empire and beyond, carrying silk, timber, and lapis lazuli. Artisans shaped bronze, carved ivory, and molded clay with a precision that seemed to catch the light of the sun itself. Each palace and each dwelling mirrored the pulse of empire. Disciplined, grand, and yet alive, each corner of the city a reflection of ambition cast in stone. Yet even as Nineveh shimmered in splendor, a shadow threaded through its grand corridors. The prophets whispered of storms yet to come, of the rivers swelling beyond measure, and of the consequences hidden beneath the golden facade. The city, radiant as the sun it was named for, carried within it the tension of its own magnificence, the delicate balance between glory and the weight that inevitably accompanies it. As the sun rose higher, gilding the walls and streets, one could almost hear the empire's breath. It was a slow, meditative rhythm, a heartbeat both steady and restless. Soldiers trained beneath the eyes of carved lions, scribes continued their eternal inscriptions, and priests lifted their prayers to Ashur and Shamash alike. All moved in concert, a symphony of human devotion and ambition that seemed to make the city itself alive. And as evening approached, shadows lengthened across Nineveh's courtyards and gates, hinting at the darker dawn that would rise with the next age of kings. Beneath the walls of Nineveh, life moved with a quiet grandeur. Ashurbanipal's vision of the city as a jewel of the north extended into every street, every gate, every carved relief that adorned the palace and temple. Lions crouched in stone, their eyes carved wide with eternal vigilance, while winged bulls loomed over the courtyards, guardians of both the living and the written word. Each image was more than decoration. It was a statement of permanence, a reminder that the empire's presence was both tangible and infinite. In the palace halls, light fell through latticed windows onto floors polished smooth by the passage of countless feet. Courtiers moved with the careful precision of ritual, their robes brushing the edges of walls painted in rich ochre and gold. Every corner held a story, of tribute brought from distant lands, of artisans whose hands had shaped the ivory and bronze into forms that captured the divine, and of the king himself, seated upon a throne carved with lions and inscriptions that declared both his power and his piety. The libraries of Nineveh became sanctuaries of thought and memory. Scribes worked tirelessly beneath the dim glow of oil lamps, pressing their reeds into clay tablets that captured everything from myth to law, astronomy to diplomacy. Stars were charted across the heavens in meticulous detail, prayers and incantations recorded for gods whose presence could be felt in every breath of the city. Time seemed to stretch within these halls, each moment slowed by the careful work of those who understood that the memory of the empire must endure long after the hand of the king was still. Even outside the walls, the city seemed to pulse with controlled energy. Markets overflowed with the colors and sense of empire, spices from the east, textiles from the west, timber and metals from distant mountains. Artisans' hammers rang through workshops, shaping bronze shields and ornamental gates, while sculptors pressed clay and stone into forms both magnificent and menacing. The soldiers' drills echoed through the streets, a rhythm as steady as the river itself, and all of Nineveh moved together in a harmony born of ambition and necessity. Yet amid this splendor, shadows whispered along the walls. The priests spoke in hushed tones of omens, rivers swelling beyond their banks, storms that tore through fields with unseasonable force, the migration of birds in patterns unfamiliar to the scholars. Even the clay tablets seemed to tremble with prescience, recording victories alongside the quiet cost of such grandeur. For every palace built, every lion carved, every wall painted in shimmering gold, there was the unspoken toll, the weight of human life, the labor pressed into service, the obedience exacted by fear as much as reverence. And still the city of the sun rose, radiant and eternal. Courtyards caught the glow of morning light, pools mirrored the heavens above, and the pulse of the empire seemed inseparable from the rhythm of Nineveh itself. Here, in this city of ambition and devotion, the Assyrian heart found both its voice and its shadow, a place where triumph and unease coexisted like twin rivers flowing silently through the soul of an empire. As twilight gathered across Nineveh's walls, painting the lion guardians in long, soft shadows, the city exhaled, and the first whispers of a darker dawn drifted across the northern plains, faint yet inexorable. Shalmaneser III, ascending the throne in the wake of Ashurnasirpal II, carried forward the dream of Nineveh, yet cast his own hand upon the city's soul. Under his reign, the courtyards expanded, temples climbed higher, and the walls themselves seemed to breathe with grandeur. Lions crouched above gateways, their eyes eternal, wings carved in stone as though they might lift into the heavens at any moment. The city, a jewel of the north, gleamed with gold and ochre, yet within its beauty the pulse of vigilance never faltered. The king moved among the city's terraces and halls like a conductor of a vast orchestra. Soldiers drilled in perfect formation beneath the eyes of winged guardians, their shields gleaming and spears aligned like rays of light striking the earth. Artisans labored with precision and devotion, shaping bronze, carving ivory, pressing clay tablets into forms that would endure far longer than the fleeting breath of men. The libraries swelled with inscriptions, each tablet a repository of memory, recording victories, treaties, and the silent prayers of those who labored to preserve the empire's legacy. The markets of Nineveh were alive with movement and color. Traders from across distant lands brought silks, spices, timber, and precious stones, their voices mingling in the hum of commerce. Every street seemed to carry both the promise of wealth and the reminder of discipline, the unspoken understanding that life in the empire demanded both reverence and obedience. Children played beneath the shadow of monumental gates, unaware that the stones themselves bore the weight of empire's history. Yet amid the city's splendor, the whispers of shadow lingered. Priests interpreted the movements of the stars, knotting patterns that seemed unusual, omens hidden in the river's flow, storms rising unexpectedly in distant lands. The clay tablets, though silent, recorded these anomalies with equal care, preserving the memory of both triumph and unease. Every palace, every lion, every winged guardian carried within it a silent reminder that grandeur always casts a shadow. The artisans of Nineveh understood this duality. They shaped images of gods and kings, blending reverence with the quiet knowledge of mortality. The bronze lions crouched with attention that seemed almost alive, the carved reliefs depicted campaigns in precise, unflinching detail, and the painted walls glimmered with stories that spoke of both power and the inexorable cost of wielding it. Within the beauty lay discipline, and within discipline, the echo of fear and the inevitability of fate. As the sun began to set over the northern horizon, its light glimmered across the river, gilding the city in a soft amber glow. Nineveh exhaled in the stillness of evening, the roar of the past quieted beneath the hush of twilight. The pulse of empire continued, eternal in ambition yet tempered by shadows, a rhythm that would carry the city forward even as omens of a darker dawn whispered across the plains. And in the fading light, as the winged guardians cast long silhouettes over courtyards and canals, Nineveh seemed to hold its breath, poised between glory and the inevitability of what was yet to come. Within the walls of Nineveh, life unfolded as if in a measured ritual. Courtyards echoed with the soft shuffle of attendants' feet, and the scent of incense mingled with the faint tang of river water carried on the morning breeze. Every palace chamber, every temple hall held the imprint of ambition and devotion. Ashurbanipal II and Shalmaneser III had built more than stone and gold. They had shaped a city that breathed, a city that seemed to exist as a reflection of the empire itself, disciplined, radiant, and yet shadowed by its own magnitude. The temples rose like mountains of devotion, their steps lined with clay tablets chronicling deeds of kings and priests alike. Priests moved through corridors of incense and fire, whispering prayers that blended with the murmurs of scholars recording the heavens above. Stars were charted across wet clay in meticulous precision. Rituals were encoded in form and gesture, each a bridge between mortal ambition and divine decree. The city was a living library, each brick and stone inscribed with the pulse of a civilization reaching toward eternity. The marketplaces below carried a different rhythm, a pulse more immediate, tactile, alive with commerce and the interweaving of countless lives. Traders shouted across stalls, children darted between feet, and the scent of spices and fresh bread filled the air. Yet even here the presence of authority was tangible. Soldiers patrolled the streets, disciplined as statues brought to life, their eyes sharp and ever watchful. Every action, every step was guided by the invisible hand of empire, the rhythm of order flowing beneath the surface of everyday life. In the workshops, artisans labored with quiet devotion. Bronze shields, ivory carvings, and stone reliefs captured the power of the kings and the stories of conquest. Yet in their hands lay more than skill, they held awareness of the subtle tensions within the city. The shadow of ambition stretched across every gate and terrace, reminding all who dwelt in Nineveh that even beauty carries weight. Each carved lion, each painted mural, spoke both of triumph and of cost. Despite the brilliance of the city, omens whispered along its walls. Rivers swelled unexpectedly, stars shifted in unusual patterns, and storms rose in lands thought calm. The priests interpreted these signs with solemn care, understanding that Nineveh's radiance could not shield it from the undercurrent of consequence that accompanied every act of power. Even the clay tablets, inscribed in perfect order, seemed to carry the echo of unease, recording not only victories but the shadows that always accompany ambition. As twilight descended, the city's glow softened. The sun's last rays glimmered across courtyards and riverbanks, gilding the towers and palaces with a gentle fire. Lions crouched above gates, winged guardians cast their long shadows across the streets, and the city's breath slowed in unison with the fading light. It was a moment suspended between grandeur and foreboding, between the triumphs of empire and the quiet knowledge that every dawn brings change, and every shadow foretells what is yet to come. And as the moon rose over Nineveh, illuminating its gates and towers with silver light, the city seemed to exhale its long, measured breath, holding within it the tension of eternity and the promise of a darker dawn poised on the horizon. Night settled across Nineveh like a soft, velvety cloak, and the city exhaled the quiet rhythm of its own magnificence. Lamps flickered in the palace halls, casting shadows across walls painted in ochre and gold, while the soft clatter of clay tablets being pressed by diligent scribes echoed faintly through corridors. Each tablet was a whisper of eternity, preserving deeds, prayers, and stars, binding the city's memory to the unyielding march of time. The soldiers who patrolled the terraces moved with deliberate grace, their armor catching the glimmer of the moonlight as though reflecting the empire's silent heartbeat. They were both guardians and instruments of the city's will, embodiments of its discipline and the quiet ferocity that underlay Nineveh's outward beauty. Their spears, polished and poised, traced the light and shadow across the courtyards, a reminder that the radiance of the city was inseparable from the vigilance that upheld it. Within the temples, priests murmured invocations to Ashur, Shamash, and the pantheon of gods whose favor had shaped the city's ascent. The incense curled into the night sky, intertwining with the fragrance of river air and the faint warmth of baked clay from the workshops. Here, in these silent, hallowed spaces, time seemed to slow. The city's pulse became a quiet meditation, a gentle rhythm that measured both devotion and ambition, triumph and the ever-present shadow of consequence. Outside the walls, the river mirrored the starlit sky, its surface disturbed only by the occasional paddle of a fisherman's boat or the distant ripple of wildlife stirring in the reeds. The city's expanse, illuminated by the soft light of the moon, revealed a tapestry of rooftops, gardens, and fortified gates, a living mosaic of empire. Even in this serene panorama, one could sense the tension beneath the beauty. The weight of victories, the lives folded into stone and clay, the unending vigilance required to maintain such brilliance. The artisans, long since retired from their daily labor, now walked through the moonlit courtyards, observing the fruits of their craft. Bronze lions crouched in quiet majesty, carved reliefs spoke of campaigns and kings, and the winged guardians gazed eastward as if anticipating the sunrise. All of Nineveh, its walls, its people, its memory, seemed suspended between the grandeur of today and the inevitability of what was yet to come. Each shadow, cast by torch or moonlight, hinted at the balance between power and its cost, a balance that the city both celebrated and feared. And as the first light of a new dawn stirred beyond the eastern horizon, painting the towers in pale gold, Nineveh held its breath. The empire's heart beat steadily beneath the palaces, the temples, and the markets, yet beneath that pulse lay the quiet murmur of caution. Victory and splendor were eternal, but shadows stretched long across the courtyards and gates, whispering of storms yet to arrive and of the darker dawn that awaited the empire's northern jewel. And so, in the hush of early morning, Nineveh stood poised, radiant as the sun it was named for, yet mindful of the shadows that would shape the years to come. carrying the empire forward into both glory and the unseen trials that destiny would weave. With the morning fully awakened, Nineveh unfolded in quiet grandeur. The streets, once shadowed, now glimmered under the soft light of day. Merchants prepared their stalls, and the aroma of baked bread mingled with the fragrant offerings of temples. Soldiers marched in measured cadence through the courtyards, their shields catching the sunlight like liquid bronze. The city seemed alive, yet its life was disciplined, an intricate choreography of labor, devotion, and vigilance, each movement reinforcing the order upon which the empire was built. In the royal palaces, Ashurbanipal's vision continued to echo through gilded halls. Reliefs carved in alabaster depicted kings and gods locked in eternal watchfulness, battles frozen in stone, and triumphs etched into eternity. Winged bulls crouched beside thrones, guardians of a power both temporal and divine. Every detail of architecture and decoration was deliberate, a manifestation of the belief that the city itself was a reflection of Assyria's destiny, grand, ordered, and eternal. The libraries, sanctuaries of knowledge, remained alive with whispered readings and the soft scratch of reed upon clay. Scholars charted the stars, chronicled the exploits of kings, and recorded omens observed in both sky and earth. Here, in these quiet halls, the pulse of the empire took a slower, contemplative beat, allowing memory to linger and knowledge to root itself as firmly as the city's walls. It was in these moments, far from battle and politics, that Nineveh's soul revealed itself, radiant yet conscious of the shadows that danced in its periphery. Artisans moved among the courtyards and workshops with measured reverence. Their hands shaped bronze, ivory, and clay, crafting lions, bulls, and other guardians that seemed poised to breathe life under the morning sun. Each piece bore the weight of both beauty and vigilance, a reminder that in Nineveh, glory was inseparable from discipline. Even as their creations adorned the city, they whispered of human toil and of the balance that must be maintained between ambition and consequence. Beyond the palace gates, the river flowed steadily, reflecting the sun and the towers alike. Its calm surface belied the labor and vigilance required to maintain the city's perfection. Fishermen's nets dipped and rose, merchants' boats drifted with the current, and the occasional stir of wildlife reminded the inhabitants that life continued beyond walls and banners. The pulse of the empire extended to every corner, both human and natural, binding them together in a rhythm that was at once gentle and unyielding. And yet in this brilliance, the prophets' whispers persisted. Omens of storms, of floods, of strange alignments in the heavens threaded through both palace and temple, reminding Nineveh that even the sunniest city cast shadows. The grandeur, though eternal in appearance, was tempered by vigilance, by awareness that every stone laid, every lion carved, every tablet inscribed was part of a delicate balance between glory and cost, between triumph and the silent trials yet to arrive. And as the day waned, painting Nineveh in a spectrum of golds and ambers, the city seemed to pause for a breath, its heart steady yet alert, ready to carry the empire onward into both radiance and the unseen shadows that would shape its future. The sun rose over the northern plains with a solemn brilliance, casting long shadows across the walls of Nineveh, the heart of an empire now stretched across continents. Under Tiglath-Pileser III, the pulse of Assyria quickened into a relentless rhythm of conquest. Armies flowed like rivers of bronze and leather across the landscape, their banners rippling in the wind, each one a silent herald of the empire's far-reaching ambition. The Tigris and Euphrates, once gentle arbiters of life, now carried the echoes of campaigns and the whisper of cities surrendered or razed. The kings of this age were both architects and warriors, shaping the destiny of men with steel and decree. Tiglath-Pileser III moved with the measured certainty of one who understood that power must be both feared and revered. His legions marched from the Levant to the deserts of the south, crossing lands whose names had been sung for centuries, now bending under the weight of Assyria's banners. The cities of Israel, Phoenicia, and Aram fell like dominoes, their kings paying tribute or surrendering to the relentless tide. And yet, amid the victories, the faint tremor of uncertainty threaded through the empire, as if the very heavens warned that ambition carries its own fragility. Sargon II continued this inexorable expansion, forging a kingdom whose heart beat in iron. The armies, drilled in relentless discipline, moved with a precision that seemed almost unnatural, their spears cutting the air in unison, their shields forming a living wall of resolve. Conquered cities burned with a terrible beauty, flames leaping to the heavens as stars extinguished by fate. Courtiers chronicled these deeds in clay and bronze, capturing both glory and fear, while the priests sought omens in the smoke and in the alignment of stars, reading the favor and wrath of Ashur in equal measure. The empire's brilliance was unparalleled. Palaces glittered with gold and lapis, walls were adorned with lions and winged bulls that seemed to watch the horizon, and libraries swelled with the record of distant lands. Markets overflowed with tribute, spices, metals, timber, and exotic goods carried from far-flung corners of the ancient world. Artisans labored with meticulous care, shaping bronze and ivory, crafting reliefs that immortalized both kings and their victories. Each creation, each inscription, each lion carved in stone became a reflection of the empire's iron heart and unyielding will. Yet beneath this magnificence lay the quiet tremor of fragility. For every city conquered, every army triumphant, the empire extended itself farther than the heart could sustain. Rivers carried whispers of rebellion and unrest. Distant provinces required governors and garrisons whose loyalty could never be entirely certain. The vastness of the kingdom, magnificent in scope, became a lattice of tension, each thread strained, each bond delicate. Even the gods' favor, long thought eternal, was measured in careful observance of omens, sacrifices, and ritual, as if the empire itself required constant appeasement to remain whole. And as the sun climbed higher over Nineveh's gates, the shadow of iron stretched across the lands, and the sky above trembled faintly, hinting at the unseen thunder that would test the empire's brilliance and the resolve of its kings. The armies of Tiglath-Pileser III moved like living rivers of bronze and leather across the plains of the Near East. Shields aligned, spears upright, and banners snapping in the wind, they carried with them not just conquest, but the presence of Assyria itself. Villages surrendered, kings bent beneath tribute, and yet the farther the legions marched, the heavier the weight of empire became. Roads once trodden by merchants now echoed with the rhythmic cadence of disciplined soldiers, the earth itself seeming to pulse beneath the march of the iron state. Sargon II, ascending to the throne, did not merely inherit the empire. He molded it further, carving new cities and expanding old ones, fortifying borders that stretched across deserts and mountains. His palace at Dur-Sharrukin gleamed under the sun, adorned with bas-reliefs of lions, winged bulls, and kings whose gaze seemed eternal. The halls echoed with the measured footsteps of courtiers and scribes, chronicling both victories and the subtle tremors of unrest that whispered through distant provinces. Even amid triumph, the tension of holding an empire so vast remained palpable, a silent current beneath the surface of gilded splendor. Across the Levant and into Egypt, Assyria's banners cast long shadows. Cities burned like stars extinguished by fate, their walls collapsing under siege engines and relentless assaults. The smoke rose in solemn pillars, carrying both terror and the awe of distant peoples. Merchants, travelers, and priests recorded these events in careful detail, preserving the narrative of glory alongside the echo of sorrow. And yet, within the splendor of Nineveh, within the meticulous inscriptions of Sargon's victories, the underlying fragility of power was never far from mind. Each conquest stretched the empire thinner, and each victory carried the whisper of potential unraveling. Soldiers returned to the capital with trophies of war, their armor scorched, their eyes bright with triumph and fatigue. In the palace courtyards, reliefs immortalized their deeds, sieges, battles, and kings enthroned amid the spoils of conquest. Lions crouched beside gates, winged bulls guarded terraces, and yet in the quiet corridors of the city, whispers of caution threaded through every chamber. Even as the empire's heart beat in bronze and stone, the human cost, labor, obedience, lives folded into the machinery of war, was felt in the hush between triumph and ritual. The libraries swelled further, tablets inscribed with campaigns, prayers, and astronomical observations, a testament to the Assyrian desire to record and control the unfolding of time. Scholars working in dimly lit halls observed the stars and interpreted omens, understanding that the favor of the gods was a balance, delicate, and mutable. Every gesture of devotion, every calculated act of kingship, was meant to appease unseen forces that could undo even the mightiest of conquests. The empire's brilliance, though dazzling, rested on the precarious intersection of human will and divine accord. And as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the walls and towers of Nineveh in amber and gold, the iron heart of the empire pulsed with both power and quiet unease, as if aware that its own weight might bend the very sky under which it ruled. Sennacherib, inheriting the throne and the vastness of Assyria, carried forward the legacy of his predecessors with a precision that bordered on ritual. His armies moved with a disciplined grace, encircling cities, laying siege to fortifications, and extending the empire's dominion from the deserts of the south to the mountains of the north. Each campaign was chronicled in stone and clay, a record not only of triumph, but of the meticulous organization that made Assyria feared across the ancient world. The cities conquered under his reign burned with a brilliance that mirrored the sun, yet left an unmistakable shadow upon the land. Walls crumbled, towers fell, and smoke rose like silent witnesses to the empire's inexorable advance. Priests interpreted these events as both a display of divine favor and a test of human endurance, reading the alignment of stars and the patterns of the rivers for signs of Ashur's will. Victory and caution existed side by side. The glory of conquest was inseparable from the weight of responsibility that stretched across every province and garrison. Within Nineveh, the pulse of empire was tangible in every stone, every courtyard, every terrace. Palaces gleamed in sunlight and flickered under the soft glow of evening lamps. Lions crouched above gates, their eyes carved wide and eternal, while winged bulls stood sentinel over ceremonial halls. The city itself seemed alive, breathing with the rhythm of military precision and the quiet devotion of priests, scribes, and artisans. Every artifact, every relief, every tablet inscribed with ink and clay carried the weight of the kingdom's ambition. The markets overflowed with tribute from distant lands, spices, metals, timber, and treasures that had journeyed across deserts and seas. Merchants, their voices soft and measured, moved among the stalls, exchanging wares and news alike. Children played in the shadows of monumental gates, unaware that each brick beneath their feet was part of a lattice of discipline and conquest. Soldiers patrolled the streets with silent vigilance, reminders that the brilliance of the city depended upon both devotion and fear. Yet even amid this brilliance, the undercurrent of fragility persisted. For every conquest and tribute, every palace and gate erected, the empire's reach stretched thinner. Distant provinces required constant oversight, garrisons maintained vigilance over lands that were still newly subdued, and the favor of the gods was carefully courted through ritual and prayer. The splendor of Assyria, radiant as it was, carried within it the delicate tension of overextension, as if the empire's very magnificence contained the seeds of its own undoing. And as twilight fell, painting Nineveh's gates and towers in deep amber and violet, the city seemed to exhale a long, measured breath, the iron heart of the empire resting, yet aware that the sky above quivered with the unseen thunder that would test its brilliance and endurance. In the quiet hours before dawn, Nineveh seemed almost to hold its breath. The city's streets were empty save for the soft footfalls of sentries, their shadows stretching across courtyards and avenues as pale light crept over the horizon. The Tigris reflected the first gold of morning, and the winged guardians atop gates and terraces caught the faint glow like sentinels of eternity. Within this serene facade, the pulse of the empire was both steady and vigilant, its rhythm marking the delicate balance between grandeur and overreach. Sennacherib's vision of the city reached beyond mere stone and brick. Palaces were expanded, gardens laid with precise symmetry, and temples adorned with reliefs of battles both mortal and divine. Lions crouched in eternal watch, wings carved with a sense of motion, eyes wide with silent authority. Each courtyard, each terrace, each hall of worship carried the weight of kingship and the discipline of an empire that measured every breath against the ledger of conquest. The city, magnificent and disciplined, became a living embodiment of the iron that shaped the state. The libraries of Nineveh, vast and solemn, held the memory of the empire within their walls. Clay tablets inscribed with astronomical observations, ritual, and war chronicles lined shelves that seemed endless, their voices silent yet potent. Scribes bent over their work, the scratch of reeds against clay marking the passage of time, the codification of empire's triumphs and tensions alike. Here, knowledge and devotion intertwined, creating a sanctuary of thought amid the fevered pulse of conquest that rippled across distant lands. Beyond the walls, soldiers maintained the empire's grip. Camps sprawled across plains, disciplined and watchful. Armies moved like rivers of bronze, banners snapping in the wind, drums beating the tempo of obedience and fear. Cities surrendered beneath their approach, walls crumbled, and smoke rose in somber pillars that told both of human resilience and the inexorable reach of Assyria's might. Yet each triumph added weight to the empire, a quiet tension threading through courtyards and corridors alike. Within Nineveh, artisans labored with meticulous devotion. Bronze shields, carved ivories, and stone reliefs captured victories and divine favor, preserving them in forms that would endure beyond the lifespan of kings. Markets brimmed with tribute from distant lands, carrying wealth, exotic goods, and reminders of the empire's reach. Life in the city, though radiant and disciplined, was threaded with awareness of fragility. The knowledge that the empire's heart, though powerful, was stretched across horizons that tested both the body of men and the patience of gods. And as the sun climbed toward noon, gilding the palace towers and courtyards in sharp light, Nineveh seemed to pulse with quiet majesty and latent tension. A city of iron breathing steadily beneath a sky that trembled with unseen thunder, poised to challenge the empire's brilliance and endurance. As the day progressed, Nineveh's heartbeat resonated across the empire like a measured drum. The courtyards, alive with the movement of courtiers, scribes, and priests, reflected the precision of Assyrian order. Every step, every gesture, carried the echo of kings long gone, inscribed in stone and clay, perpetuating both authority and memory. The city, magnificent and meticulous, existed as the visible expression of the empire's iron will. A pulse felt even in the distant provinces where garrisons upheld Sennacherib's commands. Campaigns stretched from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of the north, and the legions moved with an unerring discipline. Spears caught the sunlight, shields aligned in seamless formation, and banners rippled like rivers of color across the plains. The earth itself seemed to register the march of iron, trembling slightly beneath the weight of so many disciplined bodies. Conquered cities bore the mark of Assyrian dominion. Walls breached, gates shattered, and towers leveled, yet in each ruin, inscriptions remained, testaments to the empire's glory and to the inevitability of its reach. Inside Nineveh, palaces and temples reflected both grandeur and subtle tension. The reliefs on the walls depicted kings in eternal watchfulness, seated on thrones alongside lions and winged bulls, their gazes unwavering. Courtyards and gardens, ordered with mathematical precision, mirrored the empire's structure, beautiful, controlled, and exacting. Even the smallest detail, the curve of a balcony, the placement of a gate, the flow of a canal, was calculated to assert power and order, to shape perception as surely as the empire shaped lands and peoples. The scholars and scribes, working under the soft glow of oil lamps, recorded both omens and history. Clay tablets bore inscriptions of victories and alliances, astronomical charts and prayers meant to secure divine favor. Each tablet preserved not only the memory of triumphs, but also the delicate balance upon which Assyria's brilliance rested. The empire's heart, though mighty, was aware of its own fragility, and the meticulous recording of both fortune and warning became a ritual of vigilance against unseen threats. Outside the city walls, life in the markets and streets reflected the empire's reach. Traders arrived from distant lands bearing spices, precious metals, and exotic goods. Soldiers patrolled with quiet authority, ensuring both security and the expression of power. Children played beneath the shadows of monumental gates, their laughter threading through the rhythm of daily life, innocent to the weight that lay upon every stone and every hand. The pulse of the city was both grand and intimate, a testament to the iron discipline of the kingdom and to the tenuous hold of control across such vast domains. As the sun began to dip toward the western horizon, gilding the palace gates and temple spires in deep amber, Nineveh exhaled its measured breath. The city, radiant and disciplined, carried within it the echo of distant battles, the weight of conquered lands, and the whisper of thunder yet to come. A subtle reminder that even an empire of iron must contend with the frailty hidden beneath its brilliance. As twilight deepened over Nineveh, the city seemed to exhale the weight of its own splendor. The palace walls shimmered in the fading light, and the reflections in the Tigris mirrored both the towers above and the legions that had marched across deserts and mountains to secure the empire's dominion. Lamps were lit in courtyards and halls, casting shadows that danced across reliefs of kings, lions, and winged bulls. The air, scented with incense and the faint tang of the river, carried the soft murmur of scholars, soldiers, and servants, all part of a rhythm as precise and measured as the pulse of the empire itself. Sennacherib's campaigns had left the empire vast and potent, yet even in moments of triumph, a subtle unease threaded through the city. Governors in distant provinces reported unrest, borders stretched thin, and whispers of rebellion stirred faintly across conquered lands. The brilliance of conquest was inseparable from the fragility it concealed, and in every palace hall, in every courtyard and terrace, this tension was understood and respected. The king's authority, immortalized in stone and bronze, was tempered by the awareness that power demanded constant vigilance and ceaseless labor. Within the city, artisans worked by lamp and candle, preserving the empire in forms that would outlast fleeting lifetimes. Bronze lions crouched eternally, winged bulls gazed across courtyards, and reliefs depicted campaigns with meticulous fidelity. Each creation celebrated victory and divine favor, while quietly acknowledging the toil and discipline required to maintain an empire so vast. Markets brimmed with tribute, bringing distant lands into the heart of Nineveh, their goods both testament to Assyria's reach and reminders of the empire's delicate interdependence. The libraries, repositories of both knowledge and memory, hummed with a quiet, almost sacred energy. Scribes recorded the alignment of stars, omens observed in distant lands, and the movements of kings and armies. Every clay tablet, every reed scratch upon wet clay, was a silent reflection of the tension between ambition and the unseen forces that might undo it. Scholars interpreted each pattern, each anomaly, as a reminder that the gods' favor was never guaranteed, and that even the most brilliant empire could falter beneath its own weight. As the moon rose over Nineveh, illuminating the towers and temples in silver light, the city seemed to pause in reflection. Its heartbeat, strong and disciplined, carried both the glory of conquest and the quiet murmur of uncertainty. The empire's iron will stretched across continents, yet beneath its brilliance lay threads of fragility, awaiting only the touch of fate to test the mettle of kings and armies alike. In the hush between victory and vigilance, Nineveh exhaled the complex rhythm of an empire poised at its zenith, and as night settled fully upon the city, the stars reflected upon the river and the gates, Nineveh held its breath, radiant and disciplined, yet mindful of the unseen thunder that would shape the years to come, carrying the Iron Kingdom onward into both glory and the shadowed trials of destiny. The sun rose slowly over Nineveh, bathing the city in a muted gold that softened the harsh angles of walls and towers. In the palace, Sennacherib moved with the weight of both power and contemplation, his gaze tracing the streets, the courtyards, and the libraries where knowledge and memory intertwined. He dreamt not only of dominion, but of perfection, a capital reborn in marble and flame, a city that would endure in both glory and legend. Each stone laid, each relief carved, was a step toward this vision, and yet behind the brilliance lay the shadows of human cost and divine expectation. Babylon, distant and fabled, lingered in the king's mind like a ghost of ambition. Its walls, once proud and enduring, rose and fell beneath his campaigns, monuments to the eternal struggle between will and fate. The rivers, as patient as time itself, bore witness to the rise of cities and the subjugation of peoples. In these currents, Sennacherib saw both his triumphs and the fragility that accompanied them. Each conquest was celebrated, yet the whisper of mortality threaded through the victories, a quiet reminder that perfection is elusive and empire fleeting. Within Nineveh, the pulse of the city mirrored the rhythm of the king's thought. Courtyards hummed with the measured movement of servants, scribes, and soldiers, each fulfilling a role in the machinery of power. The marble gleamed under the sun, reliefs shimmered with the bronze of gods and lions, and the canals reflected a sky that seemed to bend in reverence to the empire. Every detail of architecture, every tablet inscribed with campaigns or prayers, was part of the living dream, a testament to ambition woven with devotion, discipline, and careful oversight. Yet dreams, however radiant, demand sacrifice. Laborers worked tirelessly in quarries and workshops, their hands shaping the raw materials of empire into forms of both beauty and authority. Soldiers stood vigilant along the walls, their eyes catching the light as they patrolled terraces and gates. Scribes bent over clay tablets in dimly lit halls, preserving memory even as time moved inexorably forward. And the king, perched above all, felt the quiet tremor of responsibility threading through every act. Every conquest, every marble pillar, every invocation to Ashur or Shamash carried the weight of unseen consequences. As the day unfolded, the city seemed to breathe with both majesty and tension. Markets overflowed with tribute, incense, metals, timber, and exotic wares from distant lands. Children laughed in the shadow of monumental gates, oblivious to the careful orchestration of power around them. Priests moved through the temples with incense and soft prayers, reading omens in the smoke and the alignment of stars. All of Nineveh existed as a reflection of Sennacherib's dream, radiant and disciplined, yet threaded with the quiet awareness of fragility. And as the sun began its slow descent, gilding the towers in pale gold and amber, Sennacherib stood on his balcony, the city sprawling beneath him like a living mosaic, and felt the subtle tremor of mortality beneath the brilliance of his dream. The evening descended upon Nineveh like a silken curtain, softening the edges of marble and brick, and imbuing the city with a sense of quiet contemplation. Sennacherib moved through the palace halls, his footsteps echoing faintly against reliefs of lions and winged bulls, each frozen in eternal vigilance. These monuments were not merely decoration, they were extensions of the king's vision, tangible expressions of his desire to shape the world according to both order and aspiration. Within every curve of stone, every inscription in clay, the pulse of his dream was etched, grand, radiant, yet inevitably tinged with fragility. Babylon, distant across the river plains, lingered like a memory both revered and resented. Its towering walls and sacred temples had long inspired awe, yet under Sennacherib's command they became instruments of ambition. The city rose beneath his hand, its gates adorned with reliefs of gods and kings, only to crumble again as campaigns continued and time pressed its inevitable claim. In these acts, the king saw both triumph and impermanence, the delicate balance between creation and destruction that defines all human endeavor. Even as he commanded armies and orchestrated urban renewal, the whisper of mortality haunted the echoing chambers of his consciousness. Within Nineveh itself, life pulsed with a rhythm both grand and subtle. Courtyards filled with the quiet footsteps of soldiers and attendants, the measured movements of scribes chronicling deeds and omens, and the meticulous labor of artisans shaping bronze, ivory, and stone. The canals glimmered in the fading light, reflecting towers and gates, while the streets echoed softly with the hum of commerce and devotion. Each element of the city was both functional and symbolic, reinforcing the notion that empire is a mosaic of human toil, ambition, and aspiration. Yet perfection, Sennacherib knew, was elusive. For every marble pillar raised, for every palace adorned with gilded reliefs, laborers toiled under sun and shadow. Soldiers bore the weight of endless vigilance, and scribes traced the passage of time in the scratch of reeds upon clay. The king's dream, radiant and imposing, depended upon countless hands and eyes, each contributing to an order as delicate as it was vast. Even the gods' favor, ever sought through sacrifice and prayer, could not be assumed. It was a living force, responding to devotion, action, and perhaps, in quiet moments, to doubt. As night deepened, the city seemed to exhale, folding into shadows and silver moonlight. Lamps flickered in courtyards, casting elongated shapes across palace walls. Scholars bent over tablets recorded the alignment of stars, the omens of distant lands, and the chronicles of campaigns. The empire's memory, held within clay and stone, was both a celebration and a caution, triumph and fragility intertwined in a delicate, unending dance. Within the palace, Sennacherib felt the weight of both legacy and mortality pressing upon him. The luminous vision of his dream interlaced with the knowledge that all human endeavor is transient, and as the moon reached its zenith, illuminating Nineveh's towers and gates in silvered light, the city appeared both eternal and vulnerable, a living testament to a king's dream, radiant yet shadowed, carrying the whisper of mortality through every street, canal, and hall. In the quiet of night, Sennacherib walked among the upper terraces of his palace, where the wind whispered through the marble colonnades and carried faint echoes of the city below. The gates, colossal and silent, seemed to hold the weight of both human ambition and divine expectation. Lions crouched eternally in stone, winged bulls bore vigilant watch over each courtyard, and the walls themselves seemed to breathe with the memory of labor, conquest, and devotion. The city was a dream-given form, a symphony of order and beauty, yet every note carried with it the shadow of impermanence. Babylon, ever in the king's thoughts, represented both triumph and the relentless passage of time. Its rebuilt walls rose in splendor, adorned with the reliefs of gods and kings, yet even as he gazed upon them, Sennacherib felt the quiet tremor of inevitability. Cities, no matter how radiant, are subject to decay. Victories, no matter how brilliant, are measured by the patience of history. And in this awareness, the king's dream was both grand and sorrowful, a meditation upon the limits of power and the ephemeral nature of human endeavor. Within Nineveh, the pulse of the city softened under the cloak of night. Courtyards were quiet, save for the occasional footfall of sentries or the soft movement of priests tending to nocturnal rituals. Lamps flickered across the reliefs of palace walls, casting shifting shadows that seemed to animate the carved figures of lions, bulls, and kings. Canals reflected the moonlight in silvered ribbons, tracing patterns that mirrored both the geometry of the city and the careful orchestration of empire. Here, order and dream converged, each gesture of construction, devotion, or inscription a note in the vast composition of Sennacherib's vision. Yet even amid this beauty, the subtle unease of mortality persisted. Laborers rested briefly after long days of work. Soldiers slept lightly, prepared to respond to any distant stir of unrest, and scribes continued their meticulous recording, tracing campaigns, omens, and star charts onto clay. The dream of the king depended upon this unceasing rhythm, yet the empire's brilliance concealed the tension that threatened to undo it. In the hush of night, the city seemed to pulse with a double rhythm, one of order and perfection, the other of fragility and whispered uncertainty. The king himself, resting upon the marble balcony, felt both the triumph of creation and the sorrow of awareness. He had shaped cities and commanded armies, yet he knew that each monument, each victory, each carefully inscribed tablet was fleeting against the inexorable currents of time. Even in the grand libraries of Nineveh, where memory and knowledge were preserved, the impermanence of all human endeavor whispered through the whole. The dream was radiant, yet it carried within it the shadow of mortality, a reminder that power, however majestic, is never eternal. And as the night deepened, stars reflected upon the canals and walls, Nineveh exhaled a soft, measured breath, a city of marble, bronze, and devotion, carrying the dream of a king whose voice would fade into dust, yet whose vision lingered, restless and unending across time and memory. The first light of dawn began to seep into Nineveh, pale and soft, brushing the towers and gates with hues of rose and amber. From his palace balcony, Sennacherib observed the city waking, streets filling with the quiet stirrings of laborers, priests, and soldiers. Each movement, each gesture, reinforced the dream he had nurtured for decades, a city perfected in order, grandeur, and devotion. Marble gleamed faintly in the new light, canals shimmered, and the reliefs of lions, bulls, and winged guardians seemed almost to breathe, animated by the quiet rhythm of the city below. In the distance, Babylon lingered like a memory etched in the currents of the Euphrates. Its walls, rebuilt and adorned under the king's hand, bore both the triumph of human ambition and the inevitability of impermanence. The temples rose with solemnity, inscriptions immortalized victories, and yet even in their radiance, Sennacherib perceived the fragile tension that threads through all human enterprise. To build was to risk collapse, to triumph was to court time's inexorable judgment. And so, the king's dream was inseparable from the shadow of mortality, a meditation upon the beauty and sorrow of power. Within the city, Nineveh moved with a rhythm both deliberate and delicate. Soldiers maintained patrols along the walls and terraces, their discipline a mirror of the empire's broader order. Scribes bent over tablets in the libraries, recording campaigns, observations of the stars, and omens interpreted from the sky. Laborers worked in the quarries and workshops, shaping marble, bronze, and clay into forms that would endure beyond their lifetime. Merchants returned from distant lands with tribute, spices, and metals, threading the far reaches of the empire into the city's living fabric. Every act, every gesture, was a reflection of the king's dream, both a triumph of human organization and a reminder of the delicate balance sustaining it. Even in the midst of accomplishment, Sennacherib remained aware of the hidden tension within his empire. Provinces distant from the capital required constant vigilance, and unrest could arise from the smallest neglect. The favor of the gods was never guaranteed, measured by ritual, devotion, and perhaps the subtle alignment of stars. Within the grandeur of palaces and temples, amidst the rhythmic cadence of courtyards and streets, the awareness of fragility threaded through every stone and tablet. The city's beauty was inseparable from the vigilance it demanded, a meditation upon power and the impermanence of human endeavor. As the sun climbed higher, casting sharper light across towers and canals, Nineveh exhaled its quiet majesty. The city, radiant and disciplined, carried within it the echo of distant battles, the weight of labor, and the subtle tremor of mortality. Each courtyard, terrace, and hall became part of a living meditation, the dream of a king, magnificent yet shadowed, poised delicately between triumph and the inevitability of decay. And as midday approached, the marble and bronze of Nineveh reflected both brilliance and impermanence, a city alive with human ambition, yet whispering softly of the fragility beneath the dream of a king whose vision would linger long after his voice had faded into dust. By the late afternoon, the light softened, spilling across Nineveh in gentle washes of gold and amber. Sennacherib moved through the palace chambers, each step measured, each thought entwined with the meticulous order of his creation. Marble floors gleamed beneath his sandals, and the walls seemed to pulse with the memory of countless hands that had shaped, carved, and adorned them. Lions crouched eternally over gateways, winged bulls gazed steadfastly from terraces, and reliefs captured both mortal triumph and divine sanction. Every detail was a testament to ambition and devotion, yet every stone whispered of the delicate balance upon which his empire rested. The king's gaze traveled beyond Nineveh, toward distant lands that had felt the reach of Assyrian power. Provinces from the Levant to Egypt had bent to his will, their wealth, labor, and tribute feeding the heart of the empire. Armies moved like living rivers, disciplined and unerring, their banners catching the sunlight as they advanced across plains and mountains alike. Yet Sennacherib knew that every conquest exacted a subtle toll. Cities conquered in the morning required vigilance by night. Loyalty was never absolute, and the shadow of unrest could stretch across leagues of territory unnoticed. Triumph and fragility walked together, entwined like the sun and its fading light. Inside Nineveh, the rhythm of the city continued with quiet insistence. Scribes recorded the movements of stars, battles, and omens, each tablet a chronicle of human endeavor and divine will. Artisans labored in workshops, shaping bronze, clay, and ivory into forms that would endure beyond the lifetime of any king. Courtyards shimmered with reflections from polished floors and calm canals, and the whispers of priests echoed softly through temple halls, offering prayers and interpretations of the gods' favor. Every act was part of the living tapestry of the king's dream, a meditation upon order, power, and mortality. Yet even as the empire thrived, Sennacherib felt the subtle tremor of impermanence threading through the city. His victories, though brilliant, could not arrest time. Marble monuments might crumble, walls might decay, and even the loyalty of distant provinces was subject to human desire and the inexorable currents of fate. In this awareness, the king's dream assumed both radiance and melancholy, an intimate meditation upon the nature of power, ambition, and the ephemeral beauty of human creation. As the sun began to descend behind the western towers, casting long shadows across courtyards and temples, Nineveh seemed to pause, holding its breath in reverence to both glory and fragility. The canals shimmered in the waning light, the marble reflected amber and gold, and the city exhaled a measured, silent rhythm, resonant with triumph yet mindful of mortality. The dream of Sennacherib, radiant and exacting, seemed at once eternal and fleeting, a meditation upon the delicate dance of ambition and impermanence that defines every empire and every human heart. And as twilight fell across the city, painting towers and gates with soft amber and violet, Nineveh exhaled its final light of day, a kingdom of marble and bronze poised between brilliance and shadow, carrying the dream of a king whose vision would linger, restless and unending, even as the voice of Sennacherib faded into the dust of history. Night descended fully upon Nineveh, draping the city in deep indigo and silvered moonlight. From the highest terraces of the palace, Sennacherib gazed upon the sprawl of streets, canals, and courtyards, each element a fragment of the vision he had pursued across decades of conquest and construction. The marble gleamed faintly beneath the stars, reflecting both the triumph of human hands and the subtle impermanence that threads through every human endeavor. Lions crouched eternally in stone, winged bulls remained vigilant on terraces, and every relief recorded the discipline and devotion of a people bound to the dream of empire. In the hush of night, the quiet pulse of Nineveh carried with it echoes of distant lands and conquered cities. Governors reported news of far provinces, some loyal, some restless, and each report threaded the awareness of fragility through the palace halls. Sennacherib knew that even in the midst of triumph, the empire required constant vigilance. The perfection of his vision of streets laid with precision, palaces adorned with marble, temples filled with devotion, was mirrored by the delicate tension that held the empire together. Every stone, every canal, every tablet bore not only testimony to human endeavor, but also to the quiet vulnerability upon which it depended. Within the city, life moved in softened rhythms. Scribes bent over clay tablets in candlelight, recording stars, omens, and chronicles of kings and campaigns. Soldiers patrolled terraces and gates, their movements measured, silent, ensuring that vigilance never slackened. Artisans shaped bronze, ivory, and marble into forms that would outlast their creators, each creation a quiet echo of ambition, devotion, and mortality. Even the children who played briefly in shadowed courtyards carried the legacy of human labor and order in their laughter, innocent yet threaded into the great design of empire. Sennacherib, seated upon the marble balcony, allowed himself a rare pause. The city beneath him shimmered, a living embodiment of vision and discipline, yet every gleam of brilliance was tempered by the whisper of impermanence. Triumph was radiant, yet fragile, creation beautiful, yet mortal. In the libraries and temples, in the streets and courtyards, the empire existed as both monument and meditation, a living dialogue between ambition and the inexorable currents of time. The dream of the king, woven into every stone and tablet, was both radiant and sorrowful, a reflection upon the nature of power itself. As the moon climbed high, casting long, silvered shadows across courtyards and towers, Nineveh exhaled its quiet, enduring rhythm. The city, magnificent yet fragile, carried the weight of labor, devotion, and human aspiration. Sennacherib's dream, radiant and exacting, seemed both eternal and fleeting, poised delicately between brilliance and impermanence. Within its walls, in the hush of night, one could feel the echo of victories, the whisper of mortality, and the unending cadence of a vision that would persist long after the king's voice had faded into the dust of history. And as stars scattered across the sky, mirrored in the quiet ribbons of the Tigris, Nineveh settled into a night both radiant and reflective, carrying the dream of Sennacherib onward, restless and unending, toward the dawn of history's unfolding pages. In the soft hush of Nineveh's courtyards, long after the echo of marching soldiers had faded, Ashurbanipal moved through the palace halls with the quiet gravity of a man who carried both empire and memory in his mind. The city, radiant in its disciplined architecture, seemed to exhale around him, each marble column and carved relief bearing witness to centuries of human ambition. Yet unlike his predecessors, whose vision had been expressed in conquest and flame, Ashurbanipal's purpose was subtler, quieter, a devotion not to walls or armies, but to the preservation of thought, the transmutation of fleeting human experience into enduring record. The libraries he conceived were more than mere collections of tablets, they were vessels for eternity. Clay, pressed with stylus and inked impressions, became a medium through which memory might defy mortality. Scholars worked by the flicker of lamp and candlelight, tracing stars, writing omens, copying histories and myths, and inscribing the knowledge of distant lands. The corridors of the library smelled faintly of dust, wax, and smoke, a fragrance as rich and layered as the empire itself. Each tablet, carefully catalogued and stored, bore not only words but the weight of human effort, the desire to capture truth, and the fragile hope that civilizations might endure beyond the span of a king. In the quiet of these halls, Ashurbanipal's presence was a subtle guiding force. He would pause before a tablet, observing the meticulous strokes of the scribe, his gaze tracing the lines of cuneiform as though absorbing both the meaning and the labor of its creation. Scholars approached him with deference, yet the king moved among them not as a tyrant, but as a custodian of memory. Knowledge itself became the measure of power, and the empire's pulse, for the first time in centuries, was expressed through wisdom rather than iron. Even in the act of collection, there was a consciousness of impermanence. Ashurbanipal knew that cities crumble, armies dissolve, and monuments erode, but words, pressed into clay and carefully preserved, might endure. Within the library's walls, there was a sacred tension, the vitality of human thought balanced against the inevitability of time. Every myth copied, every record of conquest inscribed, every omen traced by the hand of a scholar was an act of quiet defiance against mortality, a meditation upon what it means to endure beyond one's own life. Outside the library, Nineveh moved with its usual rhythm, yet the city's heart seemed to have softened, its pulse less insistent than in the days of conquest. Soldiers patrolled in disciplined silence, courtyards shimmered beneath the reflection of sunlight and water, and the murmured prayers of priests echoed faintly through temples. The empire remained vast, yet its grandeur was tempered by introspection. In this calm, the library emerged as a sanctuary, a space where ambition gave way to reflection, and the empire's sword was replaced by stylus and clay. And as the lamps flickered in quiet halls, casting long shadows across tablet-strewn shelves, Ashurbanipal's library hummed with the breath of civilization, preserving memory as the empire's pulse began to settle into the rhythm of endurance and reflection. Evening settled over Nineveh with a gentle hush, turning the city's walls and canals into pools of soft shadow and reflected light. Within the palace, the library breathed quietly, a sanctuary untouched by the clang of swords or the urgency of conquest. Here Ashurbanipal's vision unfolded in the steady hands of scribes and scholars, each tablet pressed, each inscription traced, a meditation upon time itself. Words became vessels, and in their arrangement lay the fragile hope of permanence, a rebellion against the fleeting nature of empire, a dialogue between human memory and eternity. Ashurbanipal walked slowly among the rows of shelves, observing the activity with the calm intensity of a man who understood the weight of preservation. Scholars bent over their work, tracing myths and chronicles, copying omens and incantations with precise care. Each line of cuneiform, though small and silent, carried the resonance of civilizations, Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian, woven into a single tapestry of human thought. The king's gaze lingered upon tablets that recorded distant lands, the campaigns of forebears, and the genealogies of gods. In these quiet gestures, Nineveh's grandeur shifted from conquest to contemplation, and power was measured not in armies but in the endurance of knowledge. Outside, the city seemed to pause in reflection. Courtyards were still, canals mirrored the dim glow of lamplit windows, and the distant echoes of worship at twilight drifted through the streets. Soldiers, though vigilant, moved with measured silence, as if sensing that in these hours the empire's life had transformed from force to thought. The libraries, the scholars, and the king himself embodied a quiet triumph. The belief that words might outlast stone, that knowledge could preserve the spirit of a civilization even as empires rise and fall. In the shadowed halls, the atmosphere carried both serenity and solemnity. Ashurbanipal touched a tablet inscribed with a hymn to the moon god Sin, then paused before another that detailed the campaigns of a long-departed king. In the juxtaposition of poetry and record, he perceived the fragile balance of power and permanence. The empire's glory had been won with iron and strategy. Yet here, in this repository of memory, its most enduring expression was gentler, an invocation of reflection, a monument to thought rather than to conquest. The work continued late into the night. Lamps flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the tablets, giving the impression that the words themselves breathed. Scholars whispered to one another in careful tones, their voices soft as the inked impressions upon clay. The king lingered among them, sensing the delicate rhythm of creation and preservation, aware that each careful line of script was a small defiance against oblivion. Outside, the moon rose fully over Nineveh, silvering terraces, walls, and canals, and bathing the library in a quiet, contemplative light. And as the hours deepened, the library seemed to hum with its own pulse, a pulse of knowledge, memory, and quiet triumph, preserving the soul of the empire even as the world beyond its walls whispered of change and the slow passage of time. The night deepened into a velvet quiet, and the city of Nineveh settled into the soft cadence of shadows and lamplight. Within the library, the rhythm of human endeavor continued, delicate yet persistent. Scribes bent over tablets, tracing the strokes of distant histories, myths, and hymns with unwavering concentration. Each inscription was a heartbeat, each careful line a testament to the impermanence of flesh and the enduring reach of thought. Ashurbanipal moved among them, silent and observant, a king not of war in this moment, but a guardian of memory, whose power had shifted from the forge of armies to the meticulous craft of words. He paused before a tablet chronicling the rise and fall of foreign cities, the rise of kings, and the fall of empires. His eyes traced the curves and angles of cuneiform, each character a symbol of both human triumph and fragility. In these inscriptions lay not just history, but wisdom, the distilled consciousness of generations. Through this quiet work, Ashurbanipal sought to wrest eternity from time, to ensure that the pulse of human endeavor might echo beyond the impermanence of stone, blood, and flame. The air in the library was scented faintly with the smoke of lamps, the warmth of baked clay, and the soft dust of endless years. Scholars whispered in low tones, careful not to disturb the contemplative silence that made the space sacred. Courtyards and terraces beyond the walls were bathed in moonlight, reflecting the city's stillness. In these quiet hours, Nineveh's heartbeat had shifted from conquest and command to reflection and preservation. Knowledge, rather than the sword, had become the instrument of the empire, and in it a different form of power was exercised, subtle and enduring. Ashurbanipal considered the layers of his work: records of campaigns, astronomical charts, incantations, royal decrees, and the preserved voices of poets long dead. Here, the empire's soul had been transcribed, moment by moment, clay tablet by clay tablet. Every gesture of copying and cataloging was a meditation, a deliberate act of resisting the inevitable decay that follows time and conquest. In this act, the king saw both beauty and melancholy. The empire at its height, yet aware of its own transience, its pulse softening even as civilization reached its apex. Outside, the city lay in silence, the distant hum of flowing canals blending with the whisper of wind through the terraces. The palace itself seemed to lean into this quiet, carrying the weight of centuries of ambition now tempered by reflection. Soldiers who had once marched with the rhythm of war now moved with measured care, and the courtyard seemed to exhale, their vast stones and columns absorbing the calm. Within these walls, Ashurbanipal's library became a sanctum where time itself could be held, measured, and, in a sense, suspended. And as the night deepened, the flickering lamps cast long, contemplative shadows across the clay tablets, and the library, quiet and radiant, carried within it the empire's memory. A fragile yet enduring heart, preserving the pulse of civilization as Nineveh slept beneath the endless stars. As the first pale light of dawn crept over Nineveh, the library remained a sanctuary of stillness. Ashurbanipal walked among the shelves, his steps muted upon the stone floors, and paused to examine a tablet detailing the reign of a king long gone. The words were etched with precision, each line a fragment of memory captured from a time that would otherwise have slipped into silence. Here, in the hush of morning, the pulse of the empire seemed to beat not through armies or walls, but through the quiet diligence of those who labored to preserve the knowledge of worlds. The flicker of lamps had given way to the soft luminescence of sunrise, which streamed through the latticed windows, illuminating the inscriptions with a tender clarity. Scholars moved through the aisles, carrying tablets to and fro, their voices hushed and careful, the soft rustle of clay against cloth the only sound. Each tablet, though small, was a vessel of eternity. Within these walls, myths, histories, laws, and prayers were collected, forming a mosaic of human thought, an archive of civilization's highest aspiration. The king, aware of the fragility of such endeavors, treated each tablet as a sacred trust, a fragile link between present and future. In the stillness, Ashurbanipal reflected upon the nature of his empire. Armies had marched, cities had risen and fallen, kings had lived and died, yet here in this quiet library the essence of Assyria endured. Knowledge became the measure of power, and memory the instrument of permanence. The empire's sword had once carved boundaries and silenced dissent, yet it was the stylus that now gave the empire its quiet immortality. Through the patient work of scribes, the pulse of Assyria continued, subtle and meditative, threading its story across generations. Outside, the city awakened slowly, canals shimmering in the new light, courtyards filling with merchants, priests, and laborers. Soldiers moved in disciplined patterns, yet the tension of conquest had softened, replaced by the rhythm of daily life. The palace itself, though vast and imposing, seemed to exhale, its grand halls echoing only with the quiet breath of reflection. Within the library, this stillness was intensified. Each clay tablet, each inscription was a heartbeat, carrying forward the knowledge and wisdom of countless lives. Ashurbanipal, in his thoughtful perambulation, became both guardian and witness, observing the delicate interplay between the empire's might and the fragility of time. As the morning sun warmed the terraces and courtyards, the empire's pulse, once measured in banners, victories, and the roar of battle, was now marked by the soft rhythm of preservation. Each tablet placed upon a shelf, each myth copied and catalogued, was an act of reverence, a quiet defiance against the inevitable decay of flesh, stone, and ambition. The library's walls, lined with the accumulated wisdom of centuries, became a sanctuary where the fleeting nature of life and the persistence of thought met in harmonious reflection. And as sunlight fell across Nineveh, tracing the carved lions and winged bulls, Ashurbanipal's library glimmered with the enduring light of memory, preserving the pulse of an empire whose glory had softened into contemplation, and whose legacy whispered of eternity even as time moved steadily onward. By midday, the city of Nineveh thrummed with gentle life, the sounds of laborers, merchants, and priests mingling into a quiet rhythm that seemed almost meditative. Within the library, however, time moved differently. The air was heavy with the faint scent of clay, ink, and smoke, and every footstep, every whisper, seemed magnified in the hushed expanses. Ashurbanipal observed the work of his scribes with a calm intensity, tracing in his mind the flow of knowledge that spread from hand to hand, tablet to tablet, connecting centuries of human thought. Here, the empire's heart beat not with conquest, but with memory, and the rhythm was subtler, yet enduring. The king paused before a tablet recounting the journey of merchants along the Euphrates, their caravans threading distant lands into a web of commerce and culture. Each word was a thread in the tapestry of civilization, a fragment of human experience preserved for eternity. Ashurbanipal reflected on the contrast between these quiet labors and the thunder of battle that had defined much of Assyria's history. Whereas once the pulse of empire had been measured in banners, marches, and the clash of iron, now it was measured in careful hands, meticulous records, and the disciplined minds of scholars dedicated to the preservation of knowledge. In the soft glow of the lamps and the midday sun filtering through latticed windows, the library seemed to breathe as a living entity. Scholars moved with grace and care, carrying tablets from shelf to table, copying texts and cross-referencing myths, histories, and omens. Each inscription, though silent, resonated with the continuity of human aspiration. In this space, Ashurbanipal's vision of eternity found its truest expression. A city of stone and marble, alive not merely in walls or monuments, but in the collective memory of its people, preserved in cuneiform for centuries yet to come. The king's meditation was interrupted only by the occasional whisper of a scribe seeking guidance or clarification. His presence was unobtrusive, yet profoundly felt, a quiet authority that infused the work with purpose. He understood that this repository of knowledge was more than a library, it was the soul of an empire, a delicate yet resilient testament to human endeavor. Each tablet copied, each record preserved, was a deliberate act of defiance against time's erosion, a means of extending the reach of Assyria beyond the limitations of mortality. As afternoon drifted toward evening, the city beyond the library continued its steady rhythm, canals reflecting sunlight, courtyards alive with quiet commerce, and the distant murmur of worship echoing across the terraces. Yet within the library, the pulse was meditative, almost eternal. Here, the grandeur of empire had softened into reflection, and power had transformed from iron and flame into clay and script. Every word, every inscription, was a heartbeat, a fragile yet enduring trace of the civilization that had stretched from the plains of Mesopotamia to the distant horizons of its conquered lands. And as the sun began to sink, casting long shadows across the shelves and terraces, Ashurbanipal's library glowed with the quiet triumph of human memory, a sanctuary where the empire's pulse, though subdued, persisted, an enduring whisper of civilization at its most luminous and reflective. As evening descended, Nineveh's vast streets softened under the slow drift of twilight. The Tigris mirrored the pale light, its waters tracing gentle curves along the city's edges, while in the palace the library stood as a quiet citadel of reflection. Ashurbanipal moved deliberately among the rows of tablets, each carefully catalogued, each inscribed with myths, histories, and knowledge that spanned generations. In the hush of these corridors, the pulse of empire was no longer measured by the clash of swords or the march of armies, but by the rhythm of memory preserved with care and reverence. The king paused at a shelf dedicated to celestial records. Stars, moons, and planetary movements were charted in precise cuneiform, their paths traced across clay with the same discipline that had once guided armies into foreign lands. He considered how these charts, so delicate and intricate, connected human aspiration to the cosmos itself, an eternal pattern that outlasted the ephemeral span of kings and conquests. Knowledge in this sacred space became a bridge between earth and sky, between mortality and eternity. Ashurbanipal understood that the work of preservation, though quieter than conquest, carried with it a weight and a beauty unmatched by any battlefield victory. Around him, scholars moved in slow, careful rhythm, the flicker of lamps casting soft shadows that danced across the walls and floors. The library seemed alive, not as a place of action or command, but as a living archive of human endeavor. Every tablet copied, every line etched into clay, was an act of meditation, a deliberate tethering of human experience to permanence. In this gentle, deliberate labor, the empire found a new expression of power, subtle, enduring, and luminous in its quiet triumph. The tranquility of the library contrasted sharply with the memory of Nineveh's past grandeur. Walls that had once echoed with the footsteps of marching soldiers now carried only the soft shuffle of scholars and the whispered interpretations of priests and scribes. The city itself, though still vast and magnificent, seemed to lean into reflection, as if acknowledging that the age of conquest had given way to the age of preservation. Within this transition, Ashurbanipal's vision crystallized. A repository not only of knowledge, but of the soul of the empire, a sanctuary where human aspiration could resist the eroding currents of time. As night deepened, the lamps glimmered across the library's corridors, illuminating the inscriptions with a gentle, contemplative light. Ashurbanipal lingered among them, his gaze sweeping across tablets that captured the breadth of human thought, from the histories of distant lands to the whispered prayers of forgotten kings. The quiet majesty of this space was profound. Here, the fleeting pulse of civilization found a measure of permanence, each tablet a heartbeat, each inscription a breath, preserving memory against the inevitable decay of all things. And as the moon rose high over Nineveh, silvering terraces, columns, and canals, the library glimmered with enduring light, carrying the empire's pulse forward in silence. Ashurbanipal's work had transformed the fleeting brilliance of conquest into the quiet triumph of preservation, a meditation upon eternity whispered across clay, lamp, and shadow. The memory of Ashurbanipal's library lingered like a candle's flame in the fading dusk of the empire. Yet even as knowledge was preserved in clay and script, the world beyond Nineveh's walls shifted inexorably. From distant plains and marshes, the Medes and Babylonians stirred like currents in a slow, gathering storm. Their rise was neither loud nor sudden. It unfolded with the patience of centuries, a deliberate march of inevitability. Towers that had once reflected the sun now cast long, trembling shadows, and the streets that had carried the empire's pulse began to echo with a quiet tension, the subtle prelude to dissolution. Nineveh, jewel of the north, seemed at first untouched by the winds of change. Its walls rose with familiar grandeur, carved lions guarding the gates, temples and palaces shimmering in morning light. Yet beneath the veneer of splendor, the empire's veins had thinned, stretched by decades of conquest and administration. Soldiers patrolled with precision, but their steps lacked the certainty of earlier triumphs. The heart of Assyria had grown fragile, its rhythm measured not in victories won, but in the careful maintenance of what had once been indomitable. The Medes and Babylonians approached not as a tempest, but as a shadow stretching across the horizon, subtle yet unavoidable. Kings and generals gathered their forces, yet the instruments of war seemed muted against the vastness of what Nineveh had once represented. In the hush before confrontation, the city held its breath, the winds carrying whispers of past glories and forgotten warning. Clay tablets in the library remained unchanged, but the world beyond trembled, poised on the brink of silence. Within the palace, courtyards glimmered with the morning sun, the mosaics and carved reliefs still radiating the artistry of centuries. Priests and scribes moved with a quiet diligence, tending to rituals and records, aware perhaps that the empire's grandeur had become an elegy in motion. Ashurbanipal's successors, men who had inherited the weight of civilization, now confronted the slow erosion of power. There was no clamor, no clashing of armies yet, only the soft murmur of inevitability, a recognition that the pulse of Nineveh had begun its final descent. The rivers, eternal witnesses to the empire's rise, shimmered like silver threads along the plains. Tigris and Qasr, guardians of life and memory, bore silent witness as the shadow of decline moved ever closer. Soldiers glanced at the waters with uneasy eyes, as if sensing that the streams which had nourished kings and cities alike might outlast them all. In the hush of the approaching dusk, the city's heartbeat slowed, each step upon stone streets echoing with the weight of impending silence. And as the winds stirred the leaves in the courtyards, carrying faint dust from distant horizons, Nineveh's walls held their grandeur for one last morning, unaware that the quiet requiem of centuries had already begun its inexorable rise. By midday, the stillness within Nineveh had grown heavier, as if the city itself sensed the weight of approaching change. From the distant hills and river plains, the armies of the Medes and Babylonians advanced, their presence more a shifting shadow than a storm of clamor. The towers that had once watched over countless victories now seemed brittle, their carved faces gazing silently across streets that had long known only the rhythm of power. The air carried the faint scent of smoke and dust from preparations beyond the walls, a reminder that even the most enduring civilizations are shaped by the relentless passage of time. Within the palace, Ashurbanipal's successors moved among the courtyards with measured steps, their faces drawn yet composed. The scribes, devoted to the memory of the empire, continued their work, preserving histories and omens as though these small acts could stave off the inevitable. Even as the shadow of invasion crept nearer, the stylus traced lines in quiet defiance of mortality, and clay tablets became the last repositories of a civilization that had reached the heights of human ambition. Here, knowledge and memory persisted, a silent testament to the glory that had once been, even as the empire itself trembled. The streets, which had once carried the clatter of disciplined soldiers and the vibrant march of traders, now hummed with an uneasy tension. Citizens moved in cautious patterns, their eyes flickering to the horizon where distant banners swayed. Children's laughter had become rare, replaced by whispers that spoke in muted tones of the changes they could not yet fully comprehend. Even the temples, consecrated in devotion and grandeur, seemed to absorb the foreboding quiet, their walls reverberating with prayers that might never reach the gods who had once smiled upon Nineveh. Beyond the walls, the Medes and Babylonians arranged themselves with patient strategy, a slow and inevitable tide pressing against the city's edges. Their approach was methodical, a gathering of forces that required neither the thunder of drums nor the clash of steel to signal its intent. Time itself seemed to lean toward them, each hour amplifying the fragility of Nineveh's defenses. Soldiers stationed along the ramparts felt a tremor not of earth, but of history, as if the walls themselves understood that their strength could no longer hold back the currents of fate. Inside the royal quarters, advisors whispered in subdued tones, their discussions more elegiac than urgent. Maps were traced with fingers that trembled slightly, tracing the avenues of invasion that could not be blocked. The air was heavy with the scent of incense and clay, a faint reminder of centuries of ritual, yet even these rituals could not forestall the silent erosion of empire. Ashurbanipal's vision of eternity, preserved in libraries and temples, seemed now both magnificent and impossibly fragile, a record of human endeavor poised against the inexorable march of time. And as the sun dipped toward the western hills, casting long, somber shadows across the courtyards and canals, Nineveh held its breath. The city, radiant and silent, seemed to linger on the threshold between memory and oblivion, aware only through instinct that the world outside was shifting, and that the river of history would soon reclaim all that had once been exalted in stone and word. As twilight gathered over the city, the first tendrils of smoke rose on the distant horizon, subtle at first, like a sigh escaping from the earth itself. The Medes and Babylonians had drawn closer, their forces arrayed with the inevitability of nightfall. The walls of Nineveh, once thought eternal, now cast long, trembling shadows over empty courtyards. Soldiers, their armor glinting dimly in the fading light, paced along the battlements, the rhythm of their steps hollow, a faint echo of a heartbeat that had once pulsed with certainty. Within the streets below, citizens gathered their few possessions, their faces pale with the quiet knowledge that the world they had inherited might not survive the coming night. Inside the palace, the scribes worked with a newfound urgency. Each tablet copied, each line of cuneiform etched into clay became a fragile lifeline to the memory of an empire teetering on the brink. Here, in this sanctum of knowledge, the pulse of Nineveh slowed, replaced by the meticulous, patient rhythm of preservation. Ashurbanipal's library, a repository of dreams and wisdom, glowed faintly in the twilight, a beacon of human aspiration against the darkening horizon. Even as the empire's armies could not hold back the encroaching storm, the words preserved within the library would endure, carrying the soul of Assyria beyond the decay of walls and towers. The wind carried whispers across the terraces and courtyards, sifting through the carved reliefs of lions, winged bulls, and gods long silent. These silent watchers of history bore witness to the city's final hours, their stone eyes gazing down upon streets now emptied of certainty. Families huddled together, their murmurs gentle, as if speaking too loudly might hasten the fall. The river reflected the dimming sky, its waters a mirror of the heavens, tracing a path of continuity even as human ambition dissolved. The Tigris, ever patient, carried away the echoes of the city's pride, and with it the quiet lament of kings, scribes, and citizens alike. In the hush of evening, the first walls trembled beneath siege engines and battering rams, the sound a muted pulse rather than a roar. Time moved like a silent current, slipping through the hands of those who had long believed in the permanence of stone and blood. Soldiers stood at the gates, their faces fixed and solemn, yet beneath the discipline lay the human knowledge of fragility, the recognition that no army, no king, no walls could resist the slow, inevitable tide of change. Every crack in stone and every whisper of wind carried the message that the empire, for all its grandeur, was mortal. Even as destruction began, the library remained untouched, a quiet sanctuary within the chaos. The scribes and priests clung to their work, their devotion almost sacred in its intensity. Here the pulse of Nineveh was not measured in conquest or wealth, but in memory and care. Each tablet, each inscription carried the echo of generations, resisting the fleeting certainty of fire and steel. In the fading light, the city seemed to sigh, a living elegy of triumph, knowledge, and mortality intertwined. And as darkness gathered fully over the horizon, the towers of Nineveh bent beneath the quiet weight of inevitability, the empire's heartbeat slowing into shadow, while the river, patient, and eternal, traced the path of memory where all else would be reclaimed by silence. From the ruins of Nineveh, the wind carried whispers of an empire that had once spanned horizons and rivers alike. The walls had crumbled, the towers fallen, and the echoes of banners and drums had faded into the soft hush of the plains. Yet even in decay, a pulse lingered, a quiet rhythm threaded through clay, ink, and memory. The scribes' careful hands, the inscriptions etched in temples and libraries, the artistry of reliefs carved in stone, all persisted as fragments of a civilization whose voice refused to vanish entirely. Time, patient and unyielding, had reclaimed much, yet it could not erase the essence of what had been. The Tigris and Euphrates traced their courses as they had for centuries, reflecting the pale light of dawn across the plains where cities once rose with imperious grandeur. Rivers remembered what men had forgotten, carrying the fragments of Nineveh's glory into distant lands, flowing through the landscapes of civilizations yet unborn. Farmers tilled the soil, unaware that the earth beneath their hands held the imprints of kings and scribes, of conquerors and poets alike. Through these quiet continuities, the Assyrians endured, not in armies or monuments, but in the imprint of culture, governance, and the human imagination. Art, once intended to awe and dominate, now spoke softly across the millennia. Carved lions and winged bulls, remnants of palace walls, inspired wonder in later hands, transmitting not violence alone, but a sense of design, ambition, and reverence. Cuneiform, once the instrument of kings, decrees, and scribes' devotion, became a bridge into eternity, its forms teaching later civilizations the power of record, reflection, and memory. The essence of Assyria was no longer in the stones that crumbled, but in the ideas, structures, and stories that persisted in quiet resonance. Even as deserts reclaimed courtyards and the wind sifted dust into the once great streets, the empire's rhythms endured in unexpected places. Governance, law, and organization, crafted to hold a vast, restless empire together, echoed in the administrative patterns of civilizations to come. Every tax recorded, every decree pronounced, every canal traced with painstaking care became a seed, quietly germinating in worlds far beyond the Tigris. In this, the Assyrian legacy revealed a subtle immortality, woven not from conquest, but from the enduring persistence of human order and imagination. In the hush of evening, the skies above the plains were vast and unending, a dome under which the remnants of an empire lay scattered. The stars began to emerge, pale lanterns of eternity mirrored in the river's quiet currents. Here, in the silence after the fall, history seemed not a series of endings, but a continuum, an unbroken thread connecting the past to the future, connecting the fleeting lives of men to the quiet immortality of ideas. The empire had dissolved, yet its spirit drifted on, luminous and intangible, carried by the rivers, the winds, and the memory of generations. And as the last light of day faded over the plains, the story of Assyria folded gently into the quiet night. A lullaby whispered across clay, stone, and sky, settling into the dream of eternity. Through the centuries, the remnants of Assyrian culture drifted like seeds upon the wind, carried to lands far beyond the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. The meticulous cuneiform inscriptions, once confined to the palace archives and temple sanctuaries, became the templates for later scripts and systems of knowledge. Scholars in distant kingdoms studied fragments of tablets unearthed from buried cities, discovering in their forms the elegance of thought and the depth of human aspiration. In these quiet transmissions, the Assyrian mind endured, its legacy not in the roar of conquest, but in the subtle architecture of civilization itself. The art of the empire, so fierce and magnificent in its time, found new life in the imagination of those who came after. Lions carved in stone, wings poised as if to take flight, and warriors frozen in eternal vigilance, inspired not merely as objects of power, but as expressions of the human desire to transcend mortality. Even as Nineveh itself fell to dust, these creations whispered to later architects and artists, teaching them the delicate balance of strength and beauty. Every frieze, every relief, became a silent lesson. that to leave a mark upon the world is to resist oblivion, even if the mark itself will eventually crumble. The river plains, once the lifeblood of the empire, continued their patient flow. Farmers and herders unknowingly traced the paths of ancient roads and aqueducts, their hands following the patterns laid down by engineers long vanished. The Tigris and Euphrates, eternal witnesses, carried the sediments of fallen cities to distant lands, depositing the legacy of Nineveh in the soil, in stories, and in the imagination of generations yet unborn. In the hush between floods and harvests, the pulse of an empire lingered, subtle but enduring, in ways no army or king could command. Governance and order, the frameworks of the mighty Assyrian state, left an invisible imprint upon the administration of the wider world. Methods of taxation, record-keeping, and territorial management passed silently into the consciousness of later civilizations, a quiet inheritance of efficiency and foresight. Even as kings, soldiers, and citizens faded into memory, the principles of order and structure persisted, a testament to human endeavor beyond the immediacy of power. Here, in these invisible currents, the empire's essence endured, not as monuments of stone, but as the careful architecture of civilization itself. Night fell upon the plains, the sky a deep canopy pierced with stars. Shadows of what had once been stretched across the silent ruins, as if the earth itself remembered the ambitions of men and the fleeting triumphs of kings. Yet in the darkness, the memory of Assyria glimmered softly, not as loss, but as quiet illumination, a gentle reminder that even in destruction, beauty and knowledge could survive. The echo of temples, of palaces, of libraries persisted in the rhythm of memory, carried in whispers upon the wind, in the flow of rivers, and in the distant echo of human thought. And as the stars deepened their vigil over the plains, the story of Assyria, vast and luminous, settled into eternity. From ruin to remembrance, from memory to dream, the empire endured, a quiet pulse in the endless night, a lullaby for history itself. Dawn broke slowly over the plains, pale and gentle, touching the scattered remnants of Nineveh with soft light. Dust rose from the ruins, glittering faintly as if the earth itself wished to remember the empire's fleeting brilliance. In this quiet, one could almost hear the faint echoes of voices, scribes reciting lines in cuneiform, priests chanting prayers to gods long silent, children's footsteps upon streets now vanished beneath time's inexorable hand. These echoes were fragile, yet they bore the weight of eternity, transforming the ephemeral into something lasting, something luminous. The river, patient and eternal, traced its familiar path, reflecting the nascent light of day. Its waters had witnessed the empire's rise and fall, the steady march of kings and soldiers, the flowering of art, and the meticulous work of scholars. Now it bore witness to the quiet after the empire distilled into memory, carried forward in subtle currents that nourished not crops alone, but the imagination of generations yet to come. Along its banks, grasses swayed in the morning wind, indifferent yet faithful, carrying in their motion the rhythm of centuries. Even as the stones of Nineveh lay broken and scattered, the empire's spirit endured in unexpected ways. Stories told in distant lands, myths reshaped and reborn, carried the shadow of Assyrian grandeur. Languages, governance, architectural principles, and mythic traditions absorbed echoes of this civilization, transforming them into foundations upon which future kingdoms would rise. It was not conquest that persisted, but culture. Not the sword, but memory, not the towers, but the human desire to understand, record, and endure. In the quietude of the plains, one could see how history itself bends toward remembrance. The mountains and rivers, the stars and winds, seemed to participate in the preservation of legacy, guiding the remnants of Assyria into the broader tapestry of human civilization. The empire's heartbeat, once so loud in war and construction, now throbbed softly in the cadence of ideas, in the rhythm of texts copied, in the lingering forms of carved stone. Every echo, every whisper of wind through ruined corridors, carried the pulse of an empire into eternity. As night gathered again, the sky unfolded into an infinite canopy of stars. The heavens, eternal witnesses, mirrored the empire's memory in constellations that might have seemed to shimmer with the spirits of kings and scholars alike. It was in this luminous, serene reflection that the essence of Assyria could be felt most profoundly, not in conquest or might, but in the delicate persistence of culture and thought. Here the empire had become a dream, a story carried into the consciousness of all who would follow, a lullaby whispered across time. And as the stars rose above the ancient earth, the story of Assyria drifted into the dream of eternity, settling softly into memory, where ruin had been transformed into remembrance. And the empire's pulse, though silent in stone, continued to shimmer across the flowing currents of history. From the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, where once the heartbeat of an empire pulsed, only whispers remain. The towers of Nineveh, the palaces of Ashur, the libraries of Ashurbanipal, these have long returned to dust. Yet in that dust lies a quiet immortality. The scribes' clay tablets, the carved reliefs of lions and winged guardians, the very architecture of governance and thought, all endure in the soft currents of memory, carried into the hearts and minds of generations far removed. The rivers flow as they always have, patient and eternal, reflecting the sky and tracing paths where empires once rose and fell. The plains whisper the stories of those who lived, conquered, and dreamed, preserving the essence of Assyria in ways the hands of kings could never command. Civilizations yet unborn inherit these echoes, building upon the legacy of art, language, and order. Here the Assyrians' true triumph is revealed, not in stone or steel, but in the persistence of human imagination, the quiet shaping of history itself. Night settles across the ancient lands. Stars, indifferent yet eternal, shimmer above, recalling the luminous pulse of a civilization that once stretched from river to horizon. In their light, one can feel the resonance of memory, the soft, unbroken thread that connects the past to the present, the ephemeral to the eternal. The empire has fallen, yet it has never truly vanished. It survives wherever knowledge is preserved, wherever stories are told, wherever the human spirit strives to leave a mark upon the world. And so, in the hush of ancient plains, beneath the eternal sky, the story of Assyria drifts into the dream of eternity, quiet, luminous, and enduring, its memory folded into the very fabric of time.